Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Thatcher Brannigan's Peterbilt groaned against the wind as it climbed the wet grade of Interstate 84, pushing north through the Columbia River Gorge. The November storm had turned vicious after midnight, transforming the highway into a slick ribbon of asphalt that gleamed under his headlights like polished obsidian. Rain hammered the windshield in sheets, and the wipers struggled to keep pace. Brannigan had been driving this route for 32 years, Portland to Pendleton, sometimes Boise, hauling timber, machine parts, refrigerated produce. Tonight, his load was industrial generators, high-value freight that required him to stay on schedule despite the weather. He was 49 years old, gray creeping into his sideburns, but his eyes remained sharp and his hand steady on the wheel. The digital clock on the dash read 12:47 a.m. Traffic was nearly non-existent at this hour, just the occasional eastbound truck passing in the opposite lane, headlights briefly illuminating the rain before vanishing into the darkness behind him. Brannigan preferred night driving. Fewer tourists clogging the scenic highway, fewer RVs drifting into his lane, fewer distractions. But tonight something felt off. The wind was gusting harder than the forecast had predicted, strong enough to push his loaded trailer sideways every few miles. The Columbia River, normally visible as a dark expanse to his right, was completely obscured by the storm. Even the rock face to his left, the towering basalt cliffs that defined the gorge, had disappeared behind curtains of rain. Hood River was behind him now, the last real town before the long stretch toward the Dalles. The way station appeared ahead, its yellow lights cutting through the rain like beacons. Brannigan had rolled through this station hundreds of times, usually with a green light waving him past when his truck's transponder registered clean. Tonight, the light was red. He downshifted, air brakes hissing as he guided the Peterbilt onto the approach ramp. The station itself was a low concrete building with a covered scale platform and a small office with windows overlooking the weighing area. Normally, there were at least 2 or 3 trucks ahead of him, even at this hour, but tonight the lot was empty except for a single dark SUV parked near the office and one other semi already on the scales. Brannigan pulled up behind the truck on the platform and waited. Through the rain, he could see the other driver, a younger guy in a black jacket, climbing back into his cab. The scale lights cycled green, and the truck ahead rolled forward, turning right onto the exit ramp that fed back to the highway. Brannigan eased his rig onto the scales, feeling the familiar bump as his front tires crossed the sensors. The weight readout appeared on the digital display visible through his windshield. 71,400 pounds. Well within legal limits. He expected the green light to appear within seconds, the usual automated clearance. Instead, the office door opened, and a man in a high-visibility vest stepped out into the rain, motioning for Brannigan to pull forward and park in the inspection bay. That was unusual. Random inspections happened, sure, but not typically in the middle of a storm at 1 a.m. Brannigan guided the truck into the bay and shut down the engine. The man from the office approached his driver's side window, rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He was in his 50s, thin face, sharp features, ID badge clipped to his vest that read G. Larrabee, Weighmaster. Brannigan rolled down his window halfway, letting in a spray of cold rain. "Evening," Brannigan said, keeping his tone neutral. "Something wrong with the weight?" Larrabee shook his head. "Weight's fine. Need you to step into the office for a minute." "Routine paperwork check." Brannigan frowned. "I've got my manifest, logbook, everything's current. Can't we do this here?" "Office," Larrabee repeated, his voice flat. "Won't take long." There was something in the man's tone, not hostile, but firm in a way that suggested this wasn't a request. Brannigan grabbed his clipboard with the shipping documents and climbed down from the cab, locking the door behind him. The rain was cold and heavy, soaking through his jacket by the time he reached the office entrance. Inside, the air was warm and stale, smelling of burnt coffee and damp concrete. A second man stood near the back wall, arms crossed, wearing a dark jacket with no visible identification. He was younger, maybe 35, with a thick neck and a watchful expression that made Brannigan immediately uneasy. "Have a seat," Larrabee said, gesturing to a plastic chair near the counter. "Let me see your manifest." Brannigan handed over the clipboard and sat down. Larrabee flipped through the pages slowly. Too slowly, as if he were searching for something specific rather than conducting a routine check. The other man hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but Brannigan could feel his eyes on him. The office was small, cluttered with file cabinets and outdated equipment. A CB radio crackled softly in the corner, voices indistinct beneath the static. On the wall, behind the counter, a camera monitor showed the exterior view of the scales and the approach ramp. Brannigan noticed 2 more trucks pulling in from the highway, their headlights cutting through the rain. "This load going to Pendleton?" Larrabee asked, not looking up from the paperwork. "That's right," Brannigan said. "Delivery at 7 a.m. Larrabee nodded slowly, then set the clipboard down on the counter. He reached for a different stack of papers, printed forms that looked official but unfamiliar. "We've got a situation tonight, DOT directive. All high-value freight northbound through the gorge needs secondary routing verification." Brannigan had been driving long enough to know when something didn't add up. "I've never heard of secondary routing verification. What directive?" "Came down this week," Larrabee said, his tone unchanged. "Cargo theft ring operating between here and the Idaho border. We're flagging high-value shipments, making sure they're coordinated with state patrol escorts for certain stretches." That sounded plausible enough, but something about the delivery made Brannigan's instincts flare. "My dispatcher didn't say anything about an escort." "That's what we're coordinating now," Larrabee said. He picked up a desk phone and dialed a number, speaking in a low voice that Brannigan couldn't quite make out over the rain hammering the roof. The second man finally moved, stepping closer to the counter. He still hadn't introduced himself, and Brannigan noticed he wasn't wearing any kind of badge or identification beyond the plain dark jacket. "You run this route regular?" the man asked. His voice was rough, the kind that came from years of smoking. 32 years, Brannigan said. "Then you know how it works. High-value freight, we keep an eye on it. Make sure it gets where it's going." Larrabee hung up the phone and turned back to Brannigan. "Here's the situation. There's a convoy forming up at the Rowena rest area, about 12 miles east. 3 trucks with similar loads, plus a patrol escort. You'll join them there, roll together to Pendleton. Safer that way." Brannigan didn't like it. The Rowena rest area was a small pullout with minimal lighting, not a place where convoys typically formed. "Why not just have the patrol meet me here?" "They're already staged at Rowena," Larrabee said. "Look, you're burning time arguing. Storm's getting worse. You want to sit here and debate procedure, or you want to get your delivery done?" Brannigan glanced at the monitor again. The 2 trucks that had pulled in behind him were now on the scales, and another set of headlights was visible on the approach ramp. The station was busier than he'd ever seen it at this hour. He looked back at Larrabee, then at the silent man in the dark jacket, and made a decision. "All right, Rowena rest area. I'll head there now." Larrabee handed him back the clipboard, along with a printed slip of paper. "Give this to the patrol officer when you arrive. He'll have the rest of the paperwork." Brannigan took the slip and glanced at it. It was a routing authorization form, official-looking, with a state seal and a handwritten note. Convoy departure, Zhou 230. Maintain communication channel 14. He folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket pocket, then stood up. "Thanks," he said, though the word felt hollow. Outside, the rain had intensified. Brannigan climbed back into his cab, water streaming from his jacket, and fired up the engine. As he pulled out of the inspection bay and onto the exit ramp, he glanced in his side mirror. Larrabee was standing in the doorway of the office, watching him go. The man in the dark jacket was on a cell phone, his back turned. Brannigan merged back onto I-84 eastbound, windshield wipers working overtime, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling crawling up his spine. 12 miles to Rowena. The highway stretched ahead into the darkness, rain hammering down, the Columbia River invisible somewhere to his right. Brannigan reached for his own cell phone, intending to call his dispatcher and verify the convoy story, but when he unlocked the screen, he saw the signal was dead. Not unusual in the gorge. There were stretches where cell coverage dropped to nothing, especially in bad weather. He'd try again when he reached the rest area. For now, he kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, watching for the green mileage signs that would mark his approach to Rowena. The minutes crawled past. The storm showed no sign of letting up, and the wind kept pushing his trailer sideways in gusts that made him grip the wheel tighter. At one point, a pair of headlights appeared in his mirrors, closing fast, a car or small SUV moving well above the speed limit despite the conditions. It pulled alongside him, and Brannigan glanced over, expecting to see a reckless driver. Instead, the vehicle paced him for a few seconds, close enough that he could see two figures in the front seats, both wearing dark clothing. Then it accelerated and disappeared ahead into the rain. Brannigan's unease deepened. He was starting to think that stopping at the way station had been a mistake. The sign for Rowena Rest Area appeared, reflective letters glowing in his headlights. Brannigan slowed and took the exit, descending a short ramp into a graveled parking area surrounded by trees. The rest area was small, just a loop with a few parking spaces, a covered picnic area, and a restroom building. No convoy, no patrol car, no other trucks at all. Just 3 vehicles. A dark sedan parked near the restrooms, a white panel van at the far end of the loop, and the same SUV that had passed him on the highway, now idling near the entrance with its headlights off. Brannigan brought his rig to a stop in the center of the loop, engine running, and stared out at the empty lot. His gut was screaming at him now. This wasn't right. There was no convoy, no patrol escort, no legitimate reason for him to be here. He reached for his CB radio and switched to channel 14, the frequency listed on the routing slip. Static. He tried to channel 19, the main trucker channel. More static. Then he saw movement near the sedan, 2 figures stepping out into the rain, walking toward his truck with purpose. One of them was the man in the dark jacket from the way station. The other was someone new, taller, wearing a rain slicker and carrying something in his right hand that Brannigan couldn't quite make out in the darkness. He didn't wait to find out. Brannigan released the air brake, shifted into gear, and hit the accelerator. The Peterbilt lurched forward, tires spinning briefly on the wet gravel before catching traction. He swung the wheel hard, aiming for the exit ramp. Behind him, he heard shouting, then the roar of an engine as the SUV's headlights flared to life. Brannigan kept his foot down, the truck picking up speed as he climbed back onto the highway. The SUV was right behind him now, high beams flooding his mirrors. He grabbed his CB mic and tried again, switching through channels, searching for anyone who might be listening. "This is northbound I-84, mile marker 107. I need assistance. Possible hijacking attempt at Rowena Rest Area. Repeat, I need State Patrol. Anyone listening?" The CB crackled, but no response came. Brannigan's heart was hammering now, adrenaline sharpening his focus. The SUV was still on his tail, matching his speed, occasionally pulling alongside as if trying to force him off the road. He couldn't outrun them, not in a loaded semi, not on a wet highway in the middle of a storm, but he could outlast them. Fuel, weight, momentum. Those were his advantages. He just had to stay on the road and keep moving until he reached help or the SUV gave up. The highway curved ahead, following the contour of the gorge, and Brannigan took the turn carefully, feeling the trailer sway behind him. The SUV dropped back slightly, unable to match his control. Brannigan saw another set of headlights ahead, a car, moving slowly in the right lane. He flashed his high beams, hoping to alert the driver, but the car didn't react. As he passed it, he glanced in his mirror and saw the SUV do the same, ignoring the other vehicle entirely. They were focused on him. Whatever this was, it was targeted, deliberate, and he was running out of options. Ahead, he saw the lights of another way station, this one larger, with multiple lanes and what looked like activity even at this hour. Brannigan aimed for it, praying it was legitimate and not another trap. The SUV was closing again, this time pulling alongside on his left, trying to box him in. Brannigan held his course, refusing to be intimidated, and the SUV finally fell back as they approached the way station entrance. Brannigan took the ramp, brakes screaming as he brought the truck to a controlled stop in the inspection bay. He threw the door open and jumped down, scanning the lot. 2 patrol cars were parked near the office, their light bars dark but visible. Relief flooded through him, but it was tinged with the cold realization that he still didn't know what he'd just escaped, or why someone had gone to such lengths to pull him off the highway in the middle of the night. A state trooper emerged from the office, hand resting on her sidearm, eyes sharp. She was in her 40s, compact build, badge reading M. Hollister. "What's the emergency?" she asked, her voice cutting through the rain. Brannigan took a breath and pointed back toward the highway. "Someone tried to hijack my truck, set me up at the way station back near Hood River, sent me to a fake convoy at Rowena. I barely got out." Hollister's expression shifted from cautious to alert. She keyed her radio, speaking rapidly into it, then looked back at Brannigan. "You're sure it was a setup?" "Positive," Brannigan said. "The waymaster, Gideon Larrabee, he gave me a routing slip, told me to meet a convoy. There was no convoy, just 3 vehicles and 2 guys waiting for me. When I tried to leave, they chased me." Hollister motioned him toward the office. "Inside, now. We need details, and I need to make some calls." Brannigan followed her into the warmth of the station, his hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline. Through the window, he could see the highway beyond, rain falling in sheets, and somewhere out there in the darkness, people who had tried to separate him from his truck and his cargo. He didn't know why yet, but he intended to find out, and to make sure no other driver fell into the same trap. Inside the way station office, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the cluttered desk where Trooper Maeve Hollister spread out a map of the Columbia River Gorge. Brannigan stood beside her, still dripping rainwater onto the linoleum floor, his jacket heavy and cold against his shoulders. The warmth of the room was starting to seep into his bones, but the adrenaline hadn't worn off yet. His hands were steady now, but his mind was racing through everything that had happened in the last hour, trying to piece together details that might help Hollister understand the scope of what he'd stumbled into. She was methodical, asking precise questions, taking notes in a small pad that she pulled from her uniform pocket. Every few minutes, her radio crackled with updates from other units she'd dispatched to check on the Hood River way station and the Rowena rest area. "Walk me through it again," Hollister said, tapping her pen against the map. You said the Waymaster's name was Gideon Larrabee. You're certain that's what his badge read? Positive, Brannigan said. G. Larrabee, Waymaster. It was clipped right to his vest. He looked official, high-vis gear, the whole setup. But the other guy, the one in the dark jacket, he didn't have any ID. No badge, no name tag, nothing. Hollister wrote something down, then reached for the desk phone. She dialed a number, waited, then spoke quickly. This is Trooper Hollister, badge 743. I need confirmation on staffing at the Hood River Way Station tonight. Specifically, anyone named Gideon Larrabee on duty. She paused, listening, her expression darkening. No one at all? The station's supposed to be unmanned after midnight? Another pause. Yeah. I'll hold. Brannigan felt a chill that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. If the station was supposed to be unmanned, then Larrabee and the other man had no business being there. That meant the entire setup. Red light, inspection, routing slip had been orchestrated specifically to pull him off the highway and send him into a trap. Hollister hung up the phone and looked at him, her jaw set. The Hood River Station operates on automated systems from midnight to 6 a.m. No staff on site during those hours. Whoever you talked to, they weren't DOT employees. So they faked the whole thing, Brannigan said. The red light, the weight check, everything. Looks that way, Hollister said. She picked up her radio and spoke into it. Dispatch, this is Hollister. I need units to the Hood River Way Station immediately. Possible unlawful entry and impersonation of state officials. Suspects may still be on site. Approach with caution. She released the transmit button and turned back to Brannigan. You said you have a routing slip they gave you. I need to see it. Brannigan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the folded paper, now damp from the rain. He handed it to Hollister, who smoothed it out on the desk and examined it under the light. The form looked legitimate at first glance. State seal at the top, official formatting, typed instructions. But as Hollister studied it more closely, she pointed to a detail near the bottom. This authorization code is wrong. It's close, but the format's off by 1 digit. Someone made a decent fake, but they didn't have access to the real coding system. So, what are we dealing with? Brannigan asked. Hijacking? Cargo theft? Could be, Hollister said. But the level of coordination here, taking over a way station, even temporarily, creating fake paperwork, staging vehicles at a secondary location, that's not your typical theft operation. This is organized, well-funded, and they clearly knew you were coming. She looked up at him. What's in your trailer? Industrial generators, Brannigan said. High-value freight, but nothing unusual for this route. I haul similar loads a few times a month. Hollister's radio crackled again, and a male voice came through. Hollister, this is Unit 12. We're at the Hood River Station. No vehicles on site, offices locked, no signs of forced entry, looks clean. Hollister frowned and keyed her mic. Check the control room, see if anyone's tampered with the signal lights or the scale systems. She waited, and after a moment the voice returned. Control room doors open. Looks like someone bypassed the automated system. We've got a manual override switch flipped. That's how they triggered the red light. Secure the scene, Hollister said. I'm sending forensics out there first thing in the morning. In the meantime, pull any surveillance footage from the cameras. She released the button and exhaled slowly, her frustration evident. Brannigan could tell she was dealing with something more complex than a simple truck hijacking. This was deliberate, calculated, and it suggested someone with inside knowledge of how way stations operated and when they were vulnerable. What about Rowena? Brannigan asked. Did your units check the rest area? They're en route now, Hollister said, but I'm guessing whoever was there cleared out the second you left. They're not going to stick around if they know you made it to safety. She folded the fake routing slip and placed it in a clear evidence bag, sealing it with a strip of tape. You're lucky you trusted your instincts. Most drivers would have followed those instructions without question, especially if they thought it was an official directive. Brannigan nodded, but he didn't feel lucky. He felt rattled, and more than that, he felt targeted. Someone had gone to significant effort to intercept his truck specifically, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just the generators in his trailer. Hollister seemed to sense his unease. She leaned against the desk and crossed her arms, studying him for a moment before speaking. "How long have you been running this route?" 32 years, Brannigan said. "Same company, same corridors. Portland to Pendleton, sometimes farther east into Idaho." "So you're predictable," Hollister said. It wasn't a question. "Same schedule, same stops, same roads. If someone wanted to track your movements, they'd have plenty of opportunities to learn your patterns." Brannigan hadn't considered that, but it made sense. He was a creature of habit, always had been. Same fuel stops, same rest areas, same timing on his runs. It was how he stayed efficient, how he made his deadlines, but it also made him vulnerable. "You think someone's been watching me?" "I think someone knew exactly when you'd be passing through Hood River tonight," Hollister said. "And they knew what you were hauling. That level of intel doesn't come from random observation. Either they've been tracking you for a while, or someone with access to your shipping manifests is feeding them information." The implications of that made Brannigan's stomach turn. If Hollister was right, then the threat wasn't just external, it was internal too. Someone in his own company, or someone with access to their systems, might be involved. He thought about his dispatcher, the warehouse staff, the dock workers who'd loaded his trailer that afternoon. Any of them could have passed along his schedule and cargo details. Or it could be something more sophisticated: hacked shipping records, intercepted communications. The possibilities were endless, and all of them pointed to a level of organization that scared him more than the chase on the highway. Hollister's radio crackled again. "Hollister, Unit 14 at Rowena. Rest area's empty. No vehicles, no suspects. We found tire tracks near the picnic area. Looks like multiple vehicles were here recently, but the rain's washed out most of the detail. We'll document what we can." "Copy that," Hollister said. "Return to patrol." She set the radio down and looked at Brannigan. "All right, here's what's going to happen. I'm keeping you here until we can arrange an escort for the rest of your route. I don't want you back on that highway alone, not until we know more about who's behind this." "I've got a delivery deadline," Brannigan said. 7 a.m. in Pendleton. "Your company will understand," Hollister said firmly. "And if they don't, they can take it up with the state police. Your safety is more important than a deadline." She pulled out her phone and started dialing. "I'm calling this in to our criminal investigations unit. They'll want to interview you properly, and they'll need to examine your truck and the cargo. If there's something specific about that freight that made you a target, we need to know what it is." Brannigan sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs near the wall, the exhaustion finally catching up with him. His legs ached from the tension of the drive, and his shoulders were stiff from gripping the wheel so tightly. He watched Hollister work, making calls, coordinating with other units, her movements efficient and professional. She was good at her job, that much was clear, but even she seemed troubled by what they were dealing with. This wasn't a typical highway crime. It was something bigger, more dangerous, and Brannigan had the sinking feeling that he'd become tangled in something he didn't fully understand yet. An hour passed. More troopers arrived at the way station, including a senior officer who introduced himself as Sergeant Voss. He was in his 50s, graying hair cropped short, with the bearing of someone who'd been in law enforcement for decades. Voss listened to Brannigan's account, asked a few pointed questions, then stepped outside with Hollister to confer privately. Through the window, Brannigan could see them talking in low voices, occasionally glancing back at him. When they returned, Voss pulled up a chair and sat across from Brannigan, his expression serious. "Mr. Brannigan," Voss said, "we've run a check on your cargo manifest and cross-referenced it with recent theft reports in the region. Your generators aren't just high value. They're specialized equipment with serial numbers that can be tracked. That makes them harder to move on the black market unless someone has a buyer lined up in advance. We think whoever tried to intercept you tonight had a specific customer waiting for that freight." "So this was a commissioned job," Brannigan said. "That's our working theory," Voss said, "which means it's not random and it's not opportunistic. Someone ordered this hit and they were willing to invest time and resources to make it happen. The fake way station setup, the paperwork, the staging at Rowena, that's not cheap or easy to pull off. We're looking at professionals, possibly part of a larger cargo theft ring." Brannigan absorbed that, his mind still struggling to process how close he'd come to losing everything. What happens now? "Now we investigate," Voss said. "We'll work with your company to review your shipping records, see if there's a pattern of compromised loads. We'll also pull surveillance footage from the Hood River area, see if we can identify the vehicles involved. In the meantime, I'm assigning a patrol unit to escort you to Pendleton once we've cleared your truck. You'll make your delivery, and then you'll come back here for a full debrief with our investigations team." "And if they try again?" Brannigan asked. Voss met his eyes. "They won't. Not tonight. You spooked them when you ran, and now they know we're on to them. They'll lay low, regroup, probably move to a different target. But that doesn't mean you're out of danger permanently. If they've been tracking you, they might come back. That's why we need to figure out how they got their information in the first place." Hollister stepped forward, holding a steaming cup of coffee that she handed to Brannigan. "Drink this. You've got a long night ahead, and you need to stay sharp." Her tone was kinder now, less official. "You did good out there. A lot of drivers wouldn't have questioned the setup. You trusted your gut, and that's what saved you." Brannigan took the coffee, grateful for the warmth spreading through his hands. "I've been doing this long enough to know when something doesn't feel right. I just didn't expect it to be this bad." "None of us did," Hollister said, "but we'll get to the bottom of it." She glanced at Voss, who nodded, then turned back to Brannigan. "There's one more thing we need to ask. Have you noticed anything unusual in the past few weeks? Anyone following you? Strange phone calls? Vehicles that seem to show up at multiple stops?" Brannigan thought about it, running back through his recent trips. Nothing stood out at first, but then he remembered something. "About 2 weeks ago, I was fueling up at a truck stop near Biggs Junction. There was a guy there, mid-30s maybe, sitting in a car near the pumps. He wasn't fueling up, just sitting there, watching. I didn't think much of it at the time, but when I came out of the store he was gone. Then I saw the same car, or one that looked just like it, at a rest area near Boardman a few days later." "What kind of car?" Voss asked, leaning forward. "Dark sedan," Brannigan said. "Maybe a Chevy or a Ford, hard to say, but it had tinted windows and no front plate." Voss exchanged a look with Hollister. "That fits the profile. We'll check traffic camera footage from those locations, see if we can get a plate number or a better description." He stood up, pulling out his phone. "I'm going to make some calls. Hollister, stay with Mr. Brannigan. I want someone on him at all times until we get him out of here." As Voss walked away, Brannigan took a sip of the coffee, letting the bitter warmth steady him. Hollister sat down in the chair Voss had vacated, her radio clipped to her belt, her posture relaxed but alert. "You're going to be all right," she said. "We don't let truckers get hurt on our watch." Brannigan managed a faint smile. "Appreciate that." He looked out the window at his Peterbilt, still parked in the inspection bay, rain streaming down its sides. Somewhere out there in the darkness, the people who'd tried to take it from him were regrouping, planning their next move. But for now, he was safe, surrounded by troopers who were working to unravel the conspiracy that had nearly cost him everything. He didn't know how deep this went yet, or how many people were involved, but he knew one thing for certain. His life on the road had just changed forever. The highways he'd driven for 3 decades were no longer just ribbons of asphalt. They were hunting grounds, and he'd become prey. Dawn broke over the Columbia River Gorge in shades of gray and silver, the storm finally beginning to ease as pale light filtered through the thinning clouds. Brannigan had been awake for over 20 hours straight, sustained by bad coffee and adrenaline that was now wearing thin. He sat in the passenger seat of Trooper Hollister's patrol car, watching as a forensics team worked over his Peterbilt with methodical precision. They'd been at it for 2 hours, photographing every surface, dusting for prints, examining the trailer's lock mechanisms and the cargo inside. Hollister stood nearby, talking into her radio, coordinating with units that were still combing through the Hood River way station for evidence. The morning shift change had brought fresh officers to the scene, but Hollister had stayed on, refusing to hand off the case until she had answers. Brannigan respected that kind of dedication, even as exhaustion pressed down on him like a physical weight. The lead forensics technician, a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, approached Hollister and handed her a clear evidence bag. Inside was something small and black, a device no larger than a matchbox. Hollister held it up to the light, examining it, then walked over to the patrol car and tapped on the window. Brannigan rolled it down, letting in the cold morning air. "Recognize this?" Hollister asked, showing him the device. Brannigan squinted at it. "Looks like a GPS tracker. Where'd you find it?" "Tucked up inside your rear wheel well," Hollister said. "Magnetic mount, battery-powered. Someone put it there recently, probably within the last few days, judging by how clean it is. This is how they've been following you." She turned the bag over in her hand, her expression grim. "It's commercial grade, not something you'd pick up at an electronics store. Whoever's behind this has access to professional surveillance equipment." Brannigan felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. Someone had been tracking his every move, watching his routes, learning his patterns. The dark sedan he'd seen at Biggs Junction and Boardman, they hadn't needed to follow him closely because they already knew where he was going. The tracker had given them real-time updates, letting them position themselves ahead of him, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Can you trace it?" he asked. "Figure out who bought it?" "We'll try," Hollister said. "But devices like this are sold through dozens of online retailers, often with cash purchases and no registration requirements. It's a long shot." She pocketed the evidence bag and leaned against the car door. "What worries me more is how they got access to your truck to plant it. You keep your rig locked when you're not in it." "Always," Brannigan said. "And I do walk-arounds before every trip. Check the tires, the undercarriage, the trailer connections. I should have spotted something like that." "Not necessarily," Hollister said. "These things are small, and they're designed to blend in. If it was placed while you were parked overnight at a truck stop or a depot, you might not have noticed it even if you were looking. The question is, where were you 3 or 4 days ago? We need to narrow down when and where this was installed." Brannigan thought back through his recent schedule. "I was in Portland 4 days ago, loading up at the warehouse. Parked there overnight before heading out the next morning. Then I had a delivery in the Dalles, spent a few hours at a truck stop while I waited for the next load assignment. After that, I picked up this generator shipment and started the run to Pendleton. Portland warehouse, Hollister repeated, writing it down in her notepad. That's the most likely spot. Lots of foot traffic, lots of trucks coming and going, easy for someone to slip in unnoticed. We'll get security footage from the facility, see if we can identify anyone suspicious near your truck. She closed the notepad and looked at him directly. Mr. Brannigan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there any reason someone might want to target you specifically? Any disputes with other drivers, unpaid debts, personal conflicts? No, Brannigan said without hesitation. I keep to myself, do my job, go home. I don't gamble, don't owe anyone money, don't have enemies that I know of. This isn't personal, it's about the cargo. Hollister nodded slowly. That's what I figured, but I had to ask. She straightened up and glanced back at the forensics team, who were now packing up their equipment. All right, here's the plan. We're going to escort you to Pendleton so you can make your delivery. After that, you're coming back here for a full debrief with our criminal investigations unit. They'll want to go through everything again, see if there are details you've remembered since last night. In the meantime, we're pulling all the surveillance footage we can get from truck stops and way stations along your regular routes. If this crew has been tracking you for weeks, there's a chance we'll catch them on camera somewhere. And then what? Brannigan asked. You arrest them, and I go back to driving like nothing happened? That's the goal, Hollister said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely confident. But realistically, it's going to take time to build a case. These operations are usually multi-state, involving multiple players. We'll get the people who tried to intercept you last night, but the people giving the orders, they're harder to reach. She paused, then added, You might want to consider switching routes for a while. Take different corridors, vary your schedule. Make yourself a harder target. Brannigan had already been thinking the same thing. 32 years of routine, of predictability, had made him vulnerable. He'd have to change everything. His stops, his timing, maybe even his loads. It would be less efficient, more exhausting, but it was better than ending up like the drivers in the news who'd vanished along remote highways, their trucks found abandoned and their fates unknown. He nodded. I'll talk to my dispatcher, see what we can arrange. Hollister's radio crackled, and she stepped away to take the call. Brannigan watched her through the windshield, seeing her expression shift from neutral to alert as she listened to whoever was on the other end. When she returned, her jaw was set tight. That was Sergeant Voss. They've identified Gideon Larrabee, or at least the man who was using that name last night. Real name is Elliot Drain, 46 years old, with a history of cargo theft and fraud convictions in California and Nevada. He's been off the grid for the past 2 years. No known address, no employment records. But he's got a pattern of posing as authority figures, security guards, inspectors, even law enforcement. He's good at it, apparently, good enough that most people don't question him. And the other guy? Brannigan asked. The one in the dark jacket? No ID on him yet, Hollister said. But we're working on it. We pulled partial prints from the control room at the Hood River station and we're running them through the database now. If he's got a record, we'll find him. She opened the patrol car door and slid into the driver's seat. Come on. Let's get you to Pendleton. The sooner you're done with this delivery, the sooner we can focus on finding these guys. The drive to Pendleton took just over 2 hours, with Brannigan at the wheel of his Peterbilt and Hollister's patrol car trailing close behind. Another state police unit had joined them halfway through, creating a small convoy that drew curious looks from other drivers on the highway. Brannigan kept his speed steady, his eyes scanning the road ahead and his mirrors, watching for any sign of the dark SUV or sedan from the night before. But the highway was calm. The storm had fully cleared, and by the time they reached the industrial park on the outskirts of Pendleton, the sun was breaking through the clouds in sharp, clean rays. He backed his trailer up to the loading dock, presented his paperwork to the receiving clerk, and watched as a forklift crew began unloading the generators. The whole process took less than 30 minutes, efficient and uneventful, a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. When the trailer was empty and the paperwork signed, Brannigan climbed back into his cab and pulled out of the lot. Hollister was waiting for him at the exit, her patrol car idling with the window down. "All set?" she asked. "All set," Brannigan confirmed. "Good. Follow me back to the way station. Investigations wants to talk to you before you head home." She pulled ahead, and Brannigan fell in behind her, retracing the route westward along I-84. The return trip felt longer, maybe because he was running on fumes now, his body aching for sleep and his mind replaying the events of the night over and over. By the time they reached the way station where he'd first found safety, it was nearly noon. The lot was busier now, with several trucks going through the scales and a cluster of official vehicles parked near the main office. Hollister led him inside, where a conference room had been set up with a table, chairs, and a recording device. 2 plainclothes investigators were waiting, a man and a woman, both in their 40s with badges clipped to their belts. They introduced themselves as Detectives Ruiz and Kwan, part of the Oregon State Police Criminal Investigations Division. For the next 2 hours, Brannigan went through his story again, this time in exhaustive detail. The investigators asked about everything: his cargo, his schedule, his interactions with Larrabee and the man in the dark jacket, his observations at Rowena, the chase on the highway. They showed him photographs of known cargo theft suspects, asking if he recognized any of them. He didn't. They asked about his employer, his coworkers, anyone who might have had access to his shipping manifests. Brannigan gave them names, contact information, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the leak might be coming from somewhere deeper in the supply chain. A dispatcher, a warehouse manager, someone with access to multiple drivers' schedules and loads. The investigators didn't dismiss the possibility. They took notes, promised to follow up, and assured him that they were treating this as a high-priority case. When the interview finally ended, Brannigan stepped outside into the afternoon sun, blinking against the brightness. Hollister was leaning against her patrol car, sipping from a travel mug, her uniform jacket unbuttoned now that the day had warmed up. She looked tired, but there was a faint smile on her face when she saw him. "How did it go?" "Long," Brannigan said, "but thorough. They're good at their jobs." "They are," Hollister agreed. "And they'll find the people behind this. It might take time, but they'll find them." She pushed off from the car and extended her hand. "You did the right thing, Mr. Brannigan. A lot of drivers would have kept quiet, worried about losing their jobs or being seen as troublemakers. But by speaking up, you've probably saved other drivers from falling into the same trap." Brannigan shook her hand, appreciating the sentiment even if he didn't feel particularly heroic. He felt lucky, mostly, and exhausted. "Thank you for everything, Trooper. I mean that." "Just doing my job," Hollister said, though her grip was firm and her eyes sincere. "Drive safe out there. And remember what I said. Vary your routes, change your patterns. Don't make it easy for them." Brannigan nodded and climbed back into his Peterbilt. As he fired up the engine and rolled out of the way station heading west toward Portland and home, he allowed himself a moment of relief. He'd survived. He'd escaped a trap that could have ended very differently. But as the miles passed and the gorge unfolded around him once more, those towering cliffs, that dark river, those endless curves, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Somewhere out there, Elliot Drain and his accomplices were regrouping, planning their next move, and even though Brannigan would change his routes, even though he'd be more vigilant. He knew the truth. The highways were hunting grounds now, and he was still prey. 3 days later, Brannigan received a call from Detective Ruiz. They'd identified the man in the dark jacket, a former dock worker named Marcus Pruitt, with connections to several cargo theft rings operating across the Pacific Northwest. Pruitt had been arrested at a motel in eastern Oregon, along with Elliot Drain, after a tip from an informant. Both men were facing multiple charges, including impersonation of government officials, attempted grand theft, and conspiracy. A search of their motel room had turned up fake DOT credentials, routing slips for other drivers, and detailed maps of way stations and rest areas throughout Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. The operation had been bigger than anyone had initially suspected, targeting not just Brannigan, but dozens of truckers over the course of several months. Some of those drivers, Ruiz explained, had simply never reported the incidents. They'd handed over their loads under duress, too afraid or too intimidated to go to the authorities. But the arrests of Drain and Pruitt didn't bring the closure Brannigan had hoped for. The investigation revealed that they were mid-level operatives, hired muscle carrying out orders from someone higher up the chain. That person, or persons, remained unidentified, protected by layers of intermediaries and encrypted communications. The detectives were still working the case, following financial trails and interrogating informants, but they warned Brannigan that it could take months, even years, before the full network was dismantled. In the meantime, he had to live with the knowledge that the people who'd ordered the hit on his cargo were still out there, still operating, still targeting drivers like him. Brannigan did change his routes. He started taking Highway 30 along the south bank of the Columbia, avoiding I-84 whenever possible. He varied his departure times, sometimes leaving in the afternoon instead of late at night, sometimes driving straight through without stopping. He installed additional security measures on his truck, better locks, a second dash cam, a panic button wired directly to his dispatcher, and he joined a network of drivers who communicated via encrypted apps, sharing information about suspicious activity, unusual vehicles, and potential threats. It was a new way of working, more cautious and less trusting, but it kept him safe. Mostly. 6 months after the incident, Brannigan was fueling up at a truck stop near Hermiston when he saw a familiar face across the lot. It was Trooper Maeve Hollister, now in plainclothes, talking to a group of drivers near the diner. She'd transferred to the Criminal Investigations Division, Brannigan learned later, specifically to work on cargo theft cases. She was building files, gathering intelligence, working to dismantle the networks that preyed on truckers. When she spotted Brannigan, she walked over and greeted him warmly. They talked for a few minutes, catching up, and she told him that the investigation was still active, still making progress. They'd arrested 3 more suspects connected to the Drain Pruitt operation, and they were closing in on the ringleader. She couldn't give him details. It was an ongoing case, but she assured him that justice was coming, slowly but surely. Brannigan thanked her and climbed back into his truck, watching her walk away across the lot. He didn't know if he'd ever feel entirely safe on the road again, didn't know if the people at the top of the conspiracy would ever be caught. But he knew one thing for certain. He'd survived, and he'd keep surviving, 1 mile at a time, 1 load at a time. The highways were dangerous now in ways they'd never been before, but they were still his highways, still his livelihood, still his life. And he wasn't going to let fear drive him off them. Not yet, not ever. 14 months after the Hood River incident, Thatcher Brannigan found himself sitting in a cramped conference room at the Oregon State Police headquarters in Salem, surrounded by maps, file folders, and photographs pinned to corkboards that lined every available wall. The room smelled of stale coffee and printer ink, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a persistent hum that made his head ache. Across the table from him sat Maeve Hollister, now Detective Hollister, her plainclothes attire consisting of dark jeans and a button-down shirt with her badge clipped to her belt. Beside her was a federal agent named Teresa Kavanaugh, late 40s, sharp eyes, representing the FBI's cargo theft task force that had taken an interest in the case after Brannigan's testimony had helped connect multiple incidents across state lines. They'd called him in for what they described as a critical briefing, and judging by the tension in the room, Brannigan suspected this meeting was about more than just updates. Hollister slid a photograph across the table toward him. It showed a man in his 50s, heavy-set, with thinning hair and a neatly trimmed beard. The image had been taken from a surveillance camera, slightly grainy, but clear enough to make out the details of his face. "Recognize him?" Hollister asked, her voice measured but urgent. Brannigan studied the photograph for a long moment, searching his memory. The man's features were unfamiliar, nothing about him triggering recognition. He shook his head. "Never seen him before. Who is he?" "His name is Vincent Culp," Agent Kavanaugh said, leaning forward with her elbows on the table. "He's a logistics coordinator for a shipping company based in Seattle, but our investigation suggests he's been running a side operation for the past 5 years. He brokers stolen cargo, acts as a middleman between theft crews like the one that targeted you and international buyers who don't ask questions about where the freight came from. We've been building a case against him for 18 months, and your incident was one of the key pieces that helped us identify him." Brannigan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. "So he's the one who ordered the hit on my truck." "Not directly," Hollister said. "Culp doesn't get his hands dirty. He contracts out to crews like Drain and Pruitt, provides them with intel about high-value shipments, pays them a percentage of the resale value. He's careful, uses encrypted communications, moves money through shell companies, never meets his operatives face-to-face. But we've traced financial transfers, intercepted messages, and connected him to at least 23 cargo thefts across Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana over the past 3 years. 23, Brannigan repeated, the number staggering. "How many drivers?" 31, Kavanaugh said quietly. "Some loads involved multiple drivers in convoy situations. Most of them handed over their cargo under duress and never reported it. A few tried to run, like you did. 2 of them didn't make it." She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle. "One was found dead in his truck near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Ruled a heart attack at the time. The other disappeared completely. His rig was found abandoned on a Forest Service road in Montana. We believe both were killed when they resisted or tried to escape." Brannigan's hands tightened into fists on the table. He'd known the stakes were high, but hearing the body count made it real in a way that statistics and case files couldn't. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because we're moving on Culp," Hollister said. "Tomorrow morning, federal and state agents are executing search warrants on his home, his office, and 3 properties we believe he uses as storage for stolen goods. We're also arresting 12 individuals connected to his network, including 2 dispatchers who've been feeding him shipping information from inside trucking companies. This is a coordinated takedown, and if it goes right, we'll dismantle the entire operation." "And if it doesn't go right?" Brannigan asked. Kavanaugh met his eyes. "Then Culp will know we're on to him, and he'll disappear. Men like him have exit strategies, fake identities, offshore accounts, safe houses in countries without extradition treaties. We'll lose him, and the network will rebuild under someone else. That's why this has to be clean and decisive." "What do you need from me?" Brannigan asked. "Testimony," Hollister said. "When this goes to trial, and it will go to trial, we'll need you to testify about what happened that night. The fake way station, the routing slip, the chase. Your account is one of the few where we have hard evidence tying Drain and Pruitt directly to a theft attempt. and through them to Culp. Without your testimony, the case is weaker. Brannigan had known this request was coming eventually, but hearing it out loud still made his stomach tighten. Testifying meant putting himself back in the spotlight, reliving the night he'd nearly lost everything, and potentially making himself a target again if Culp's network had people still on the outside. But he also knew he didn't have a choice. Not really. If he stayed silent, the people responsible would walk free, and more drivers would end up like the ones in Idaho and Montana. "I'll testify," he said. "Whatever you need." Hollister's expression softened slightly, relief visible in her eyes. "Thank you. I know this isn't easy, but it's the right thing." "There's one more thing," Kavanaugh added. "We believe Culp has been monitoring certain drivers even after failed theft attempts, keeping tabs on them in case they become useful again, or in case they pose a threat to his operation. That GPS tracker we found on your truck? It wasn't a one-time thing. We found similar devices on 5 other trucks belonging to drivers who escaped or resisted. Culp's paranoid, and he likes to know where potential witnesses are at all times." Brannigan felt his blood run cold. "Are you saying he's been tracking me this whole time?" "We don't think so," Hollister said quickly. "After we found the first tracker, we did a full sweep of your truck every time you came in for maintenance or inspections. We haven't found anything since. But we can't be certain he hasn't been using other methods, traffic cameras, informants at truck stops, even social media if you've posted about your routes." "I don't use social media," Brannigan said. "And I've been careful. Changed my routes, varied my schedule, kept my head down." "That's good," Kavanaugh said. "But we're going to take additional precautions. For the next 72 hours, until the arrests are made, we're assigning a protective detail to you. Plainclothes officers will be monitoring your home and following you if you go out. It's just temporary, until we're sure Culp and his people are in custody." Brannigan didn't like the idea of being watched, but he understood the necessity. If Culp suspected the investigation was closing in, he might try to eliminate witnesses before the arrests could be made. "All right, what do I need to do?" "Go home," Hollister said. "Stay there. Don't take any new loads. Don't answer calls from unknown numbers. And if you see anything suspicious, vehicles you don't recognize, people watching your house, you contact me immediately." She slid a business card across the table with her personal cell number written on the back. "Day or night, I don't care. You call." Brannigan pocketed the card and stood up, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling over him. 14 months of looking over his shoulder, of changing routes and second-guessing every interaction, and now it was all coming to a head. He wanted it to be over, wanted to go back to the way things were before that November night in the gorge, but he knew that was impossible. The road had changed, and so had he. "I'll be careful," he said. "We know you will," Hollister said, standing as well. She walked him to the door, and as he stepped into the hallway, she added, "This is almost over, Mr. Brannigan. Just a little longer." Brannigan nodded and left the building, stepping out into the cool afternoon air of Salem. The protective detail was already in place. He spotted the unmarked car parked across the street, 2 officers inside watching him with casual but obvious attention. He climbed into his personal vehicle, a beat-up Ford pickup that he used when he wasn't hauling freight, and started the drive back to Portland. The highway stretched out before him, familiar and treacherous, and he kept his eyes on the mirrors the entire way home. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of nervous waiting. Brannigan stayed in his small house on the outskirts of Portland, blinds drawn, phone within reach at all times. The protective detail rotated shifts every 12 hours, different faces in the unmarked cars, but always the same watchful presence. On the second night, Hollister called with an update. The raids had been successful. Vincent Culp had been arrested at his home in Seattle without incident, along with 9 of his associates. 3 others were still at large, but warrants had been issued and law enforcement across the region was on alert. The storage properties had yielded a massive haul of stolen goods: industrial equipment, electronics, pharmaceuticals, even vehicles, all cataloged and traced back to specific thefts over the past 3 years. It was, Hollister said, one of the largest cargo theft busts in Pacific Northwest history. Brannigan allowed himself a moment of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that 3 members of Culp's network were still out there. Hollister assured him that they were low-level operatives, likely to flee rather than retaliate. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. He'd spent over a year living in a state of heightened vigilance, and he wasn't ready to let his guard down just yet. The protective detail was pulled after the 3rd day, with Hollister promising that patrols would increase in his neighborhood for the next few weeks as a precaution. Brannigan thanked her and tried to settle back into some semblance of normalcy, though he found it difficult to relax even in the safety of his own home. 2 weeks later, he received a call from his dispatcher. The company wanted him back on the road. There was a high-priority load heading to Boise, and they specifically requested him for the job. Brannigan hesitated, the memory of that night in the gorge still fresh despite the passage of time. But he also knew that he couldn't hide forever, couldn't let fear dictate his life. He'd been a trucker for over 3 decades, and the road was who he was. If he gave that up, then Culp and his network had won, even from behind bars. So he said yes, agreed to take the load, and spent the next day preparing his Peterbilt for the trip. He did a thorough inspection, checking every inch of the undercarriage for tracking devices, examining the locks and seals, verifying the cargo manifest against the actual freight. Everything checked out. Everything was clean. The drive to Boise was uneventful, almost anticlimactic. Brannigan took Highway 84 through the gorge, the same route he'd been avoiding for months, and nothing happened. The wait stations were staffed with legitimate personnel who waved him through without incident. The rest areas were quiet, populated only by other truckers taking their mandatory breaks. The weather was clear, the traffic light, and he made excellent time. When he delivered the load in Boise and started the return trip to Portland, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. The road was still dangerous. It always had been, always would be. But it was no longer hunting him. The predators who'd turned the highways into their personal territory were locked up, their network dismantled, their operation exposed. Months passed. Vincent Culp's trial began in federal court, a sprawling case involving dozens of witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. Brannigan testified on the 4th day, spending 6 hours on the stand recounting the events of that November night. He described the fake way station, the man calling himself Gideon Larrabee, the trap at Rowena, the chase through the storm. The defense attorneys tried to poke holes in his testimony, suggesting he'd been confused or mistaken, but Brannigan held firm. He had the dashcam footage, the routing slip, the GPS tracker, all of it backed up his account. When he finally stepped down from the stand, Hollister was waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom. She didn't say anything, just nodded once, a gesture of respect and gratitude. Brannigan nodded back and left the building, ready to put the entire ordeal behind him. The verdict came 3 months later. Guilty on all counts. Vincent Culp was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 15. Elliot Drain and Marcus Pruitt, who'd already been convicted in state court, received additional federal sentences that would keep them locked up for the rest of their lives. The 2 dispatchers who'd fed Culp information were sentenced to 10 years each, The remaining operatives were still being tracked down, but the core of the network had been destroyed. For the trucking community, the case became a cautionary tale and a rallying cry. Industry groups pushed for better security measures, stronger vetting of logistics personnel, and more robust reporting systems for suspicious activity. Brannigan became something of a reluctant spokesperson, giving interviews to trade publications and speaking at safety conferences about his experience and the importance of trusting one's instincts. But despite the recognition and the sense of justice served, Brannigan never forgot the 2 drivers who hadn't made it. The one found dead in Idaho, and the one who disappeared in Montana. Their names were John Hartwick and Samuel Vega, both veteran truckers like himself, both family men with decades of experience on the road. They'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, had crossed paths with Culp's network, and had paid the ultimate price. Brannigan attended a memorial service for them, held at a truck stop in eastern Oregon where hundreds of drivers gathered to honor their memory. He stood among them, listening to the eulogies, watching as a convoy of trucks rolled past in tribute, horns blaring in a mournful symphony. And he made a silent promise to himself that he would never forget, never let his guard down completely, never assume the road was entirely safe. Years later, when Brannigan finally retired from trucking at the age of 63, he looked back on that November night in the gorge as the moment everything changed. It had cost him his sense of security, his peace of mind, and countless hours of sleep. But it had also taught him something valuable. That survival wasn't just about skill or luck, but about awareness, about trusting your instincts when something felt wrong, about refusing to become a victim even when the odds were stacked against you. He'd escaped the trap that night, had outrun the predators, and had lived to tell the story. Not every driver could say the same, and that, more than anything else, was what kept him vigilant until the very end. Maeve Hollister, now a senior investigator with the Oregon State Police, continued to work cargo theft cases for another decade, building on the foundation laid by the Culp investigation. She became one of the foremost experts in the field, consulted by agencies across the country, and credited with dismantling 3 more major theft networks during her career. She and Brannigan stayed in touch over the years, occasional emails and phone calls, checking in on each other, sharing updates about cases and life. When Brannigan retired, Hollister sent him a handwritten note that he kept pinned to the wall of his garage, where his old Peterbilt sat in storage. "You did good out there. The road is safer because of you." Brannigan read that note often, especially on nights when the memories crept back in, the sound of rain hammering the windshield, the glare of headlights in his mirrors, the cold realization that he was being hunted. But he also remembered the feeling of freedom when he'd escaped, the relief of reaching safety, the satisfaction of seeing justice served. The highways had been hunting grounds once, filled with predators who saw truckers as easy prey. But they'd underestimated the resilience of men like Brannigan, the ones who refused to be victims, who fought back and survived. And in the end, that made all the difference. The Columbia River Gorge still stretches across Oregon, a place of stunning beauty and hidden danger, where the wind howls through the cliffs and the rain falls in relentless sheets. Truckers still drive through it every day, hauling freight across the state, keeping the supply chains moving. Some of them know the story of Thatcher Brannigan and the night he outran a cargo theft ring. Others don't. But all of them share the same quiet understanding that the road demands respect, vigilance, and a willingness to trust your gut when something doesn't feel right. Because sometimes, the difference between making it home and becoming another statistic is nothing more than a single moment of clarity in the darkness. A refusal to follow orders that don't make sense, a decision to run when every instinct screams danger, a belief that survival is worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Lyle Covington had been driving through Oregon winters for 26 years, and he'd learned to read the sky the way sailors read the sea. On this particular February afternoon, as his freightliner climbed the western approach to Santiam Pass, the clouds hanging over the Cascade Mountains looked wrong. Too low, too dense, with that peculiar yellowish tint that promised heavy snow before nightfall. He was hauling restaurant equipment from Eugene to Bend, a routine run he'd made at least 100 times, but something about the conditions today made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The weather forecast that morning had called for light snow, maybe 2 or 3 inches, nothing a seasoned driver couldn't handle. But the forecast had been wrong before, and Covington had been caught in enough mountain storms to know when the mountains were preparing to close their grip. He was 51 years old, lean and weathered, with close-cropped gray hair and hands that bore the calluses of decades gripping a steering wheel. His company, Cascade Freight Solutions, specialized in cross-mountain hauls, and Covington was one of their most reliable drivers, always on time, always professional, never filing complaints about difficult conditions. That reputation had earned him seniority and the better routes, but it had also made him complacent in ways he was only now beginning to recognize. Today's load was worth nearly $40,000 in stainless steel kitchen equipment, and his delivery window in Bend was narrow. The restaurant chain that had ordered the freight was opening a new location in 3 days, and delays would cost them money. Covington had promised his dispatcher he'd make it through, snow or no snow, and he intended to keep that promise. The highway narrowed as it climbed, twisting through old-growth forests that pressed close on both sides. Douglas fir and hemlock towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow from the previous week's storm. Covington kept his speed steady at 40 miles per hour, well below the posted limit but appropriate for the conditions. The road was still mostly clear, though patches of black ice gleamed in the shadows where the afternoon sun couldn't reach. He passed a green mileage sign indicating that the summit was 8 miles ahead, and he felt a flicker of relief. Once he crested the pass and started the descent toward Sisters and Bend, the worst would be behind him. The eastern side of the Cascades was usually drier, less prone to the heavy accumulation that plagued the western slopes. But the snow started falling 20 minutes earlier than he'd expected, transitioning from a few lazy flakes to a dense curtain of white in the span of 5 minutes. Visibility dropped rapidly, shrinking from a quarter mile to barely 100 feet. Covington switched on his headlights and fog lamps, but the beams only seemed to make things worse, reflecting off the swirling snow and creating a disorienting haze. He downshifted, slowing to 30 miles per hour, then 25, feeling the tires struggle for traction on the increasingly slick surface. The wipers worked overtime, scraping thick accumulation from the windshield every few seconds. Behind him, the trailer fishtailed slightly on a curve, and he corrected instinctively, years of muscle memory guiding his hands. This was bad, worse than he'd anticipated, and it was getting worse by the minute. The radio crackled with chatter from other drivers, voices tense and clipped as they reported conditions along the pass. Northbound at mile marker 73, visibility near 0, recommend chains or wait it out. Eastbound trucker here, just past the summit, road's a skating rink, be advised. Covington reached for his CB mic and keyed it. This is westbound freightliner at mile marker 68, conditions deteriorating fast. Anyone know if ODOT's closing the pass? Static answered him, followed by a voice he didn't recognize. They're talking about it, but nothing official yet. If you're already up there, keep moving or find a pullout. Don't stop in the travel lanes. Covington had no intention of stopping in the lanes, but finding a pullout in this whiteout was nearly impossible. The shoulder had vanished beneath the snow, and the edge of the road was marked only by reflective posts that appeared and disappeared in the swirling white like ghosts. He kept his eyes locked on the yellow center line, using it as his only reliable guide, and tried to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in his gut. He'd driven through worse than this, or at least he thought he had. The problem was that every storm felt different. Every stretch of mountain road had its own personality, and Santiam Pass in a February blizzard was notoriously unpredictable. Then, without warning, the Freightliner's rear wheels broke traction. Covington felt the trailer begin to swing out to the left, the weight of the cargo pulling it into a skid. He turned the wheel into the slide, easing off the accelerator, fighting to regain control. For a few terrifying seconds, the entire rig slid sideways across both lanes, the trailer threatening to jackknife. Covington's hands moved with practiced precision, feathering the brakes, adjusting the steering, doing everything his decades of experience had taught him. The truck straightened out, momentum bleeding away, and he brought it to a controlled stop on what he hoped was the shoulder. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system. He'd avoided disaster by inches, maybe less. He sat there for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, breathing hard. The snow continued to fall in thick, relentless sheets, piling up on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. He checked his mirrors, but visibility was so poor he couldn't see more than a few feet behind him. The road was empty, no headlights, no other vehicles. He was alone up here, stranded on the side of a mountain in a blizzard that showed no signs of easing. Covington reached for his phone to call his dispatcher, but when he unlocked the screen he saw the dreaded words, "No service." He tried the CB radio again, cycling through channels, but all he got was static. The storm was blocking everything. That left him with two options: sit here and wait for the storm to pass, which could take hours or even overnight, or attempt to continue forward and hope he could make it to the summit and down the other side before conditions became completely impassable. Neither option was appealing. If he stayed put, he risked getting buried under snow or being hit by another vehicle that couldn't see him in time. If he kept moving, he risked another skid or worse, a rollover, a collision, or sliding off the road entirely into the trees or a ravine. Covington had never been good at sitting still, had never been the type to wait for rescue when he could solve his own problems. So he made the decision to keep going, to push through to the summit and down the eastern slope where the snow would be lighter and the road safer. He eased the Freightliner back into gear and crept forward, tires crunching through the fresh accumulation. The road climbed steadily, each curve requiring total concentration, each straightaway a test of nerve. The snow was coming down so hard now that the headlights were almost useless, illuminating nothing but a wall of white. Covington navigated by instinct and memory, recalling the shape of the road from countless previous trips, trusting that the pavement beneath the snow was where he thought it was. He passed a yellow sign warning of a sharp curve ahead, and he slowed even further, taking the turn at barely 15 miles per hour. The trailer swung wide but held, and he exhaled in relief. Then the Freightliner shuddered. A deep, mechanical grinding sound came from somewhere beneath the cab, followed by a loss of power. The engine didn't die, but it sputtered, coughing like a sick animal. Covington's eyes shot to the instrument panel, scanning for warning lights. The check engine light flared to life, along with the oil pressure warning. His stomach dropped. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a mechanical failure, happening at the worst possible moment in the worst possible place. He coaxed the truck forward another 100 yards, searching desperately for a safe place to stop, and spotted a wide pullout ahead on the right side of the road. It looked like a maintenance area, maybe a spot where snowplows turned around. He aimed for it, the engine still coughing and sputtering, and brought the rig to a shuddering halt. Silence. The engine died completely, and the only sound was the wind howling outside and the rhythmic thump of snow hitting the windshield. Covington sat in the sudden quiet, staring at the dashboard, trying to process what had just happened. He turned the key, attempting to restart the engine. It cranked weakly but didn't catch. He tried again. Same result. On the third attempt there was nothing, no cranking, no sound at all. The battery was dead, or something worse. He was stranded on Santiam Pass in a blizzard with no engine, no heat, and no way to call for help. Covington zipped up his jacket and pulled on his heavy gloves, preparing to step outside and assess the damage. But before he could open the door, headlights appeared through the snow, not from the road but from behind him, inside the pullout. A vehicle had been parked there the entire time, hidden by the storm, and now it was moving toward him. It was a large tow truck, painted bright yellow with emergency lights on the roof. As it pulled alongside his Freightliner, Covington could make out the lettering on the door: Hanlon Recovery and Towing. The driver's door opened, and a man climbed out, bundled in a thick parka and wearing a reflective vest. He was in his 40s, stocky build, with a face that was hard to read in the dim light and swirling snow. The man approached Covington's window and motioned for him to roll it down. Covington cranked the manual handle, at least that still worked, and the window descended a few inches, letting in a blast of cold air and snow. "You broken down?" the man shouted over the wind. "Engine died," Covington shouted back. "Won't restart. I think it's the fuel system, maybe the battery." The man nodded, as if this was a common problem. "You're lucky I was up here. I run recovery operations for this section of the pass. Name's Pruitt Hanlon. I can tow you down to my yard in Sisters, get you looked at. No charge for the tow. ODOT contracts us to clear stranded vehicles during storms." Covington hesitated. Something about the timing felt off. Hanlon had been parked here, waiting, almost as if he'd known someone would break down in this exact spot. But the alternative was staying here, freezing in a dead truck while the storm buried him. And if Hanlon was telling the truth about the ODOT contract, then this was exactly the kind of help Covington needed. "All right," he said. "How long will it take to hook me up?" 10 minutes, Hanlon said. "Stay in your cab, keep warm as you can. I'll get you secured and we'll head down the mountain." He disappeared into the snow, and Covington heard the sound of chains rattling and metal clanging as Hanlon worked behind the Freightliner. True to his word, 10 minutes later there was a solid thump as the tow bar connected, and then Hanlon was back at the window. "All set. I'll take it slow, keep you stable. Just steer as best you can and let me do the pulling." The tow truck's engine roared to life, and Covington felt the Freightliner lurch forward as Hanlon began the slow descent down the eastern side of the pass. The ride was nerve-wracking, the dead truck sliding and swaying behind the tow vehicle, but Hanlon seemed to know what he was doing. They descended through the storm, visibility still near zero, the wind battering both vehicles. Covington gripped the steering wheel even though he had no power, trying to keep the front wheels aligned, trusting that Hanlon wouldn't let him slide off the road. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 minutes, the snow began to lighten. They'd dropped below the worst of the storm, and the road ahead became visible again, plowed and sanded, with reflective markers clearly delineating the lanes. Hanlon pulled them into a small town that Covington recognized as Sisters, though he'd never stopped here before. They passed a few closed businesses and a darkened gas station, then turned onto a side road that led into an industrial area on the edge of town. Hanlon's tow yard was at the end of the road, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. The yard itself was large, filled with vehicles in various states of disrepair. Wrecked cars, abandoned trucks, rusted equipment covered in snow. Hanlon guided the Freightliner through the open gate and parked it near a large metal building that looked like a combination garage and office. He climbed out of the tow truck and walked back to Covington's window. "We'll get you sorted out in the morning," Hanlon said. "It's too late tonight, and my mechanic's gone home. You can sleep in your cab if you want, or I've got a cot in the office. Your choice." Covington considered his options. He didn't like the idea of spending the night here, but the storm was still raging up in the pass, and trying to get back on the road tonight would be suicide, even if his truck were running. "I'll take the cot," he said. "Appreciate the help." Hanlon nodded and led him into the office, a cramped space with a desk, filing cabinets, and a small wood stove that radiated warmth. Covington settled onto the cot in the corner, exhaustion finally catching up with him. But as he lay there, listening to the wind howl outside and the creak of metal in the yard, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation wasn't right. Hanlon had been too convenient, too perfectly positioned, and the way he'd looked at the Freightliner, not with the detached professionalism of a tow operator, but with something else: interest, calculation, like he was already figuring out what the truck and its cargo were worth. Covington woke to the sound of metal scraping against metal, a harsh grinding that pulled him from a restless sleep filled with dreams of sliding trucks and endless white roads. The office was dim, lit only by the faint gray light of dawn filtering through a grimy window. The wood stove had gone cold during the night, and his breath misted in the frigid air. He sat up on the cot, every muscle in his body stiff and aching, and reached for his phone. Still no service. The storm must have knocked out the cell towers, or maybe Sisters was just one of those mountain towns where coverage was spotty at best. He pulled on his boots and jacket, then stepped outside into the tow yard. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow. Everything was white. The vehicles, the ground, the roofs of the buildings, all buried under at least a foot of fresh powder. The sky was clear now, a brilliant blue that seemed almost unnatural after the claustrophobic grayness of the blizzard. Covington's breath plumed in the cold air as he walked toward the source of the noise. His Freightliner was parked where Hanlon had left it the night before, but now the hood was open and someone was working inside the engine compartment. Covington approached cautiously, boots crunching through the snow, and saw Hanlon bent over the engine, tools spread out on the fender. The tow operator looked up as Covington drew near, his face smudged with grease. "Morning," Hanlon said, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. "Figured I'd take a look at your engine while you were sleeping. Wanted to see what we're dealing with." Covington stopped a few feet away, crossing his arms against the cold. "Find anything?" "Fuel pumps shot," Hanlon said, straightening up and wiping his hands on a rag. "Looks like it seized up, probably from contaminated fuel, or maybe just age. Hard to say without tearing it apart. You're going to need a replacement, and that's not something I keep in stock for a rig this size. I can order the part, but it'll take 3, maybe 4 days to get here." 3 or 4 days. Covington's delivery window was already blown. He was supposed to be in Bend yesterday afternoon. His dispatcher would be furious, the client even more so, but there was nothing he could do about it now. "What's the damage going to cost me?" Hanlon tilted his head as if calculating. "Fuel pump for a Freightliner this model runs about $800 plus labor. Call it $1,200 total, give or take. I can start working on it as soon as the part arrives. In the meantime, you're welcome to stay here, or I can arrange a ride for you to Bend if you need to deal with your client." $1,200 wasn't catastrophic, but it was more than Covington wanted to spend, especially since his company's insurance had a high deductible for mechanical failures. He'd have to eat most of the cost himself. "I'll stay here," he said. "I need to be with my truck." The cargo's valuable, and I'm not leaving it unattended. Suit yourself, Hanlon said. He closed the hood and gathered his tools, tossing them into a metal toolbox. There's a diner in town, about a mile down the road. You can walk there, or I can give you a lift if you need breakfast. Coffee here's terrible, trust me. Covington nodded. I'll walk, need to stretch my legs anyway. He glanced around the yard, taking in the rows of damaged vehicles, the high fence, the isolation. You run this place by yourself? Mostly, Hanlon said. I've got a mechanic who comes in a few days a week, and a guy who helps with heavy tows when I need it. But yeah, it's pretty much just me. Been doing this for 15 years, ever since I moved up here from California. It's good work, steady anyway. Mountain roads keep me busy, especially in winter. There was something in Hanlon's tone that Covington couldn't quite place. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction. The kind of voice someone uses when they talk about a business they've built from nothing. But there was also a guardedness, a careful quality to his words, as if he were measuring each sentence before speaking it. Covington had spent enough years on the road reading people, dispatchers, dock workers, other drivers, to recognize when someone was holding something back. Hanlon was friendly enough, professional even, but there was a wall behind his eyes that Covington couldn't see past. All right, Covington said. I'll head into town, make some calls, let my dispatcher know what's going on. You'll call me when the part comes in? Absolutely, Hanlon said. He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it over. That's my cell number. I'll keep you updated. Covington took the card and walked toward the gate, which stood open despite the early hour. As he stepped through onto the side road, he glanced back over his shoulder. Hanlon was standing beside the Freightliner, staring at the trailer with that same calculating expression Covington had noticed the night before. The tow operator seemed to realize he was being watched and quickly turned away, busying himself with locking the toolbox. Covington kept walking, but the unease in his gut deepened. Something was off about this whole situation, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Hanlon's interest in his truck went beyond a simple tow and repair job. The walk into Sisters took 20 minutes, long enough for Covington to work some warmth back into his limbs and clear his head. The town was small, maybe a few thousand people, with the main street lined with shops and cafes that catered to tourists heading to the ski resorts farther west. The diner Hanlon had mentioned was easy to find, a low building with a neon sign that read High Desert Cafe, its windows fogged with condensation. Covington pushed through the door into a wave of warmth and the smell of coffee and bacon. The place was half full, mostly locals judging by their work clothes and weathered faces. He took a seat at the counter and ordered coffee and eggs, then pulled out his phone. Still no service. The waitress, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a bun, noticed his frustration. "Cell towers are down," she said, pouring his coffee. "Storm knocked them out last night. Should be back up by this afternoon, but you never know. You stuck here?" "Truck broke down on the pass," Covington said. "Getting it fixed at Hanlon's place." The waitress's expression shifted slightly, not quite a frown, but something close. "Hanlon's yard, huh? How much is he charging you?" $1,200 for a fuel pump and labor. She set the coffee pot down and leaned against the counter, lowering her voice. "That's steep. I'm not saying Pruitt's dishonest, but he's got a reputation for finding problems that maybe weren't there before. You might want to get a second opinion before you let him start tearing into your engine." Covington felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "You think he's scamming me?" The waitress shrugged. "I'm not accusing anyone of anything. But there have been other drivers who came through here with breakdowns, got towed to his yard and ended up paying more than they expected. Some of them said their trucks were running fine before they hit the pass, then suddenly they weren't. Could be coincidence. Mountain roads are hard on vehicles, but it's worth keeping in mind. Covington thanked her and nursed his coffee, his mind racing. If Hanlon was deliberately sabotaging trucks to generate business, that would explain the convenient timing of the breakdown and the tow operator's presence in the pullout. But it seemed like an extreme risk. Tampering with vehicles on a mountain pass during a storm could get people killed, not just stranded. And yet, the more Covington thought about it, the more sense it made. A fuel pump failure wasn't catastrophic or dangerous, just inconvenient. And if Hanlon had a way to cause it remotely or through contamination, he could create a steady stream of customers without arousing too much suspicion. But that theory raised another question. How would Hanlon know which trucks to target? He couldn't sabotage every vehicle that came through the pass. That would draw too much attention. He'd need to be selective, choosing trucks with valuable cargo or drivers who were unlikely to make a fuss. Covington's load was worth $40,000, and he was an independent contractor working for a mid-sized company, not a major carrier with the resources to investigate every breakdown. He fit the profile perfectly. The waitress returned with his breakfast, and Covington ate mechanically, barely tasting the food. When he finished, he paid the bill and asked if there was a mechanic in town besides Hanlon. The waitress gave him directions to a small garage on the other side of Sisters, run by a man named Ed Talbot. Covington thanked her and walked through the snow-covered streets until he found the place, a modest shop with a single bay and a hand-painted sign. The owner, Talbot, was a lean man in his 70s with oil-stained hands and sharp eyes. Covington explained his situation, describing the breakdown and Hanlon's diagnosis. Talbot listened, then shook his head slowly. "Pruitt Hanlon's a piece of work. I won't say he's crooked outright, but I wouldn't trust him farther than I could throw him. If he says you need a fuel pump, you might or you might not. Hard to tell without looking at it myself. Problem is, your truck's in his yard, and he's not going to let me in there to check it." "Why not?" Covington asked. "Because he knows I'd call him out if he was pulling something," Talbot said. "Look, I've been working on trucks in this town for 50 years. I've seen guys like Hanlon come and go. They set up shop, run a clean operation for a while, then start cutting corners or finding ways to pad the bills. Some of them get caught, some don't. Hanlon's smart. He keeps things just legal enough that no one can prove anything. But I've had drivers come to me after dealing with him, and the stories they tell, let's just say I wouldn't let him touch my vehicle." Covington felt the knot in his stomach tighten. "So, what do I do? I can't just leave my truck there." "You could file a complaint with the state. Get an inspector out here to look at it," Talbot said. "But that'll take days, maybe weeks. And in the meantime, your truck's sitting in his yard racking up storage fees. Or you could pay him, get your truck back, and chalk it up to bad luck. Neither option's great, but those are your choices." Covington thanked Talbot and walked back toward the tow yard, his mind churning. He needed evidence, something concrete that would prove Hanlon was running a scam. But how was he supposed to get it? He couldn't sneak into the yard at night. The fence was topped with barbed wire and probably alarmed. He couldn't confront Hanlon directly without risking his truck or his cargo, and he couldn't just walk away, not with $40,000 of equipment sitting unguarded in a yard run by someone he didn't trust. As he approached the gate, he saw a pickup truck parked near the office, a battered Ford with mud-caked fenders and a rusted tailgate. A woman was standing beside it, talking to Hanlon through the office window. She was in her 40s, dressed in ranch clothes, jeans, a heavy coat, work boots, with dark hair pulled back under a knit cap. Covington slowed his pace, lingering near the fence, trying to overhear the conversation without being obvious. "I'm telling you, Pruitt, that truck was running fine when I brought it in last week," the woman was saying, her voice sharp with frustration. "Now you're saying it needs a new transmission? That's a $5,000 repair. I didn't break it, Dinah, Hanlon replied, his tone patient but firm. I'm just telling you what I found. The transmission's shot. You can get a second opinion if you want, but you'll pay me for the diagnostic either way. The woman, Dinah, shook her head in disgust. This is the third time in 2 years I've had a vehicle break down right after you towed it. You think I don't see the pattern? You're running some kind of scam, and I'm done with it. I'm calling the state police. Hanlon's expression didn't change, but his voice hardened. You do that, but until they show up, your truck stays in my yard, and the storage fees keep adding up. You want it back, you pay what you owe. Simple as that. Dinah stared at him for a long moment, then turned and stalked toward the gate. Covington stepped aside as she passed, and their eyes met briefly. She looked angry, yes, but also defeated, as if she'd been fighting this battle for a long time and knew she wasn't going to win. Covington waited until she'd climbed into a second vehicle, an old sedan parked on the street, and driven away before approaching the office. Hanlon was back at his desk filling out paperwork, and he looked up as Covington entered. Get breakfast? Hanlon asked, his tone as casual as ever. Yeah, Covington said. He hesitated, then decided to test the waters. Ran into someone at the diner who mentioned you've had some complaints, drivers saying they got overcharged. Hanlon's expression didn't flicker. People complain about everything. Comes with the business. If I fixed their truck for free, they'd complain about the wait time. If I did it overnight, they'd complain about the quality. You can't please everyone. Fair enough, Covington said. He glanced out the window at his Freightliner, still parked where he'd left it. When do you think that fuel pump will arrive? Ordered it this morning, Hanlon said. Should be here Thursday, maybe Friday if there are shipping delays. I'll call you as soon as it's in. Covington nodded and left the office. His mind made up. He wasn't going to sit around waiting for Hanlon to fix his truck or make the problem worse. He needed to find a way to inspect the Freightliner himself, see if the fuel pump really was broken or if Hanlon had tampered with it. And he needed to do it without Hanlon knowing. That meant waiting until dark, when the yard was closed and Hanlon had gone home. It was risky, possibly illegal, but Covington couldn't see any other option. He wasn't going to let himself be scammed, and he wasn't going to let his cargo sit in a yard run by someone he didn't trust. He spent the rest of the day walking around Sisters, killing time and planning his move. He bought supplies at a small hardware store, a flashlight, a set of basic tools, and a pair of bolt cutters in case he needed to get through the fence. He found a motel on the edge of town and checked in, paying cash to avoid leaving a paper trail. The room was cheap and drafty, with thin walls and a sagging bed, but it would do. As evening fell and the temperature dropped, Covington sat by the window, watching the street outside and waiting for full darkness. His phone finally regained service around 8 o'clock, and he immediately called his dispatcher to explain the situation. The conversation was tense. His dispatcher was unhappy about the delay and the cost, but there was nothing to be done now except wait for the repair and hope the client didn't cancel the contract. By 10 o'clock, the town was quiet. Covington pulled on his jacket and gloves, grabbed the flashlight and tools, and walked back toward the tow yard. The streets were deserted. Most of the businesses closed, only a few streetlights casting pools of yellow light on the snow. The yard's gate was locked, as he'd expected, and the office was dark. No vehicles in the lot, no sign of Hanlon. Covington circled the fence looking for a way in that wouldn't require cutting through the barbed wire. On the far side, he found a section where the chain link had sagged, creating a gap near the ground just large enough to squeeze through if he was careful. He dropped to his stomach and wriggled under the fence, the cold snow soaking through his clothes, then stood up on the other side, brushing himself off. The yard was eerie at night, the wrecked vehicles casting long shadows in the moonlight. Covington moved quickly but quietly, staying low and avoiding the open areas where he'd be visible from the street. His Freightliner was parked near the back, beside the garage building. He approached it cautiously, checking the cab door, locked as he'd left it. He used his key to open it and climbed inside, then popped the hood release. The metal creaked loudly in the silence, and Covington froze, listening. No sounds except the wind and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. He slid back out of the cab and raised the hood, shining his flashlight into the engine compartment. The fuel pump was right where it should be, bolted to the engine block. Covington leaned in, examining it closely. The casing was intact, no visible cracks or damage. He checked the fuel lines, looking for signs of contamination or tampering. Everything looked normal, too normal. If the pump had really failed catastrophically, as Hanlon had claimed, there should be evidence. Leaked fuel, burnt wiring, something. But there was nothing. Covington's suspicion deepened. He reached into the engine bay and tried to wiggle the fuel pump, testing its connections. It was solid, firmly attached, and when he tapped it with his knuckle, it sounded intact. Then he saw it, a small wire, disconnected, hanging loose near the fuel pump's electrical connector. It was barely visible in the dim light, but once he spotted it, everything made sense. Hanlon hadn't broken the fuel pump. He'd simply disconnected the wire that powered it, causing the engine to lose fuel pressure and stall. It was a simple, reversible sabotage that would look like a legitimate failure to anyone who didn't know what to look for. And once Hanlon replaced the pump, or more likely, just reconnected the wire and charged Covington $1,200, the truck would run fine again, and Covington would be none the wiser. Except now he was wiser. He'd caught Hanlon in the act, or at least found evidence of the scam. Covington pulled out his phone and took several photos of the disconnected wire, making sure the fuel pump and surrounding components were visible in each shot. Then he carefully reconnected the wire, snapping it back into its proper socket. He closed the hood as quietly as he could and climbed back into the cab. The key was still in the ignition where he'd left it. He turned it, holding his breath. The engine cranked once, twice, then roared to life, running smoothly. No sputtering, no warning lights, no problems at all. Covington let the engine idle for a moment, his hands trembling with a mixture of anger and relief. Hanlon had lied. The truck had never been broken, and if Hanlon was willing to sabotage his vehicle for a $1,200 payday, what else was he capable of? Covington shut off the engine and sat in the darkness, trying to decide his next move. He could drive out of the yard right now, smash through the gate if he had to, and get the hell away from Sisters and Pruitt Hanlon. But that would mean leaving without proof, without a way to hold Hanlon accountable for what he'd done. And more importantly, it would mean abandoning the woman he'd seen earlier, Dinah, who was clearly dealing with the same scam and didn't have the resources to fight back. No, Covington decided. He wasn't going to run. He was going to expose Hanlon, document the scam, and make sure no other driver got caught in this trap. But he needed help. Someone local, someone who knew the system and could back up his claims. He thought of the waitress at the diner, the mechanic Ed Talbot, and the woman Dinah. Between them, they might have enough evidence and testimony to bring Hanlon down. Covington climbed out of the truck and carefully lowered the hood, then made his way back across the yard toward the gap in the fence. As he slipped under the chain link and back onto the street, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. The yard was still and silent, the vehicles locked behind their fence like prisoners. But not for long. Covington was going to make sure of that. Covington returned to his motel room just after midnight, his clothes damp from crawling under the fence and his mind racing with what he'd discovered. He sat on the edge of the bed, reviewing the photos on his phone. Clear images of the disconnected wire, the fuel pump housing, the electrical connector. It was solid evidence enough to prove that Hanlon had sabotaged his truck. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough to shut down the operation. He needed witnesses, documentation, and most importantly, he needed to understand the full scope of what Hanlon was doing. If the tow operator was running this scam on multiple drivers, there had to be a paper trail. Invoices, repair orders, complaints filed with the state. Covington just had to find it. He lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and tried to piece together a plan. First thing in the morning, he'd track down Dinah Mercier and show her the photos. She'd been vocal about her suspicions, and if she had similar documentation from her own experiences with Hanlon, they could build a case together. Then he'd go back to Ed Talbot's garage and see if the mechanic knew of other drivers who'd been scammed. With enough testimonies and evidence, they could file a formal complaint with the Oregon Department of Transportation and possibly get law enforcement involved. It wouldn't be quick, and it wouldn't be easy, but Covington had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when he knew he was in the right. Sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by dreams of sliding trucks and locked gates. When dawn broke, pale and cold, Covington was already awake, showered, and dressed. He grabbed coffee and a muffin from the motel's front desk and headed back into town. The streets were quiet at this early hour. Most businesses still closed, only a few locals out shoveling snow from their driveways. Covington walked to the High Desert Cafe, hoping the waitress who'd warned him about Hanlon would be working the morning shift. He was in luck. She was behind the counter pouring coffee for a handful of regulars who sat hunched over their breakfasts. She recognized him immediately. "You're the trucker from yesterday. How's your rig?" "That's what I need to talk to you about," Covington said, lowering his voice. "You were right about Hanlon. He didn't just overcharge me. He sabotaged my truck to create a problem that didn't exist. I've got proof." He pulled out his phone and showed her the photos. The waitress studied them for a moment, her expression hardening. "I knew it," she said quietly. "I've suspected for years, but no one's ever had the guts to call him out. Most drivers just pay up and leave, too worried about missing their deadlines to make a fuss." She glanced around the diner, making sure no one was listening, then leaned closer. "There's a woman you need to talk to, Dinah Mercier. She runs a cattle ranch about 10 miles outside town. Hanlon's pulled the same stunt on her multiple times, always finding expensive problems with her vehicles right after he tows them. She's been documenting everything, keeping records, but she hasn't been able to get anyone to take her seriously. If you've got hard evidence, she'll want to see it." "How do I find her?" Covington asked. The waitress grabbed a napkin and scribbled directions. "Take Highway 20 east. Turn onto Cloverdale Road. Follow it about 3 miles until you see the sign for Mercier Ranch. Can't miss it. Big wooden gate with a cattle brand burned into it. Tell her Betty from the cafe sent you." She handed him the napkin, then added, "Be careful. Hanlon's got friends in this town. People who profit from his business look the other way when questions get asked. If he finds out you're poking around, he might do more than just overcharge you." Covington thanked her and left the cafe, climbing into his rental car, a beat-up sedan he'd arranged through a local garage after explaining his situation. The drive to Mercier Ranch took 20 minutes. The highway cleared of snow, but icy in patches where the morning sun hadn't yet reached. He turned onto Cloverdale Road, a narrow 2-lane that wound through open fields and stands of juniper. The ranch appeared exactly as Betty had described it. A sprawling property with white-painted fences, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a 2-story house with smoke rising from the chimney. Covington pulled up to the gate, which was closed but not locked, and got out to open it. As he drove through, a pair of border collies came bounding across the yard, barking, but not aggressive, tails wagging. Dinah Mercier emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on a rag. She was dressed in the same work clothes Covington had seen her wearing the day before. Jeans, boots, a heavy canvas jacket. Her expression was guarded as she approached, clearly wondering who this stranger was and what he wanted. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but wary. "My name's Lyle Covington. I'm a trucker. Got stranded on Santiam Pass 2 days ago, and Pruitt Hanlon towed me to his yard. Betty at the cafe told me I should talk to you." He paused, watching her reaction. The mention of Hanlon's name made her jaw tighten. "What about Hanlon?" she asked. "He sabotaged my truck," Covington said bluntly. "Disconnected a wire to make it look like the fuel pump failed, then quoted me $1,200 for a repair I didn't need. I've got photos proving it. Betty said you've been dealing with the same thing." Dinah's eyes narrowed, but there was a spark of interest now, a flicker of vindication. "Come inside," she said. "We need to talk." The house was warm and cluttered in the way of working ranches. Boots by the door, coats hung on pegs, a stack of feed catalogs on the kitchen table. Dinah poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from Covington, motioning for him to show her the photos. He handed over his phone, and she scrolled through the images slowly, studying each one. When she finished, she set the phone down and leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "I knew he was crooked, but I couldn't prove it. Every time I accused him of something, he'd have an explanation. Normal wear and tear, bad luck, coincidence. But this," she tapped the phone, "this is concrete. You can see exactly what he did." "How many times has he done this to you?" Covington asked. 3 times in the last 2 years, Dinah said. "First, it was my ranch truck. He claimed the transmission was shot after he towed it following a flat tire. Cost me $5,000. Then it was my ATV. Said the engine needed a complete rebuild. Another $3,000. Most recently, it was my diesel pickup. He diagnosed a cracked cylinder head, wanted $7,500 to fix it. That's when I started pushing back, demanding second opinions, asking questions. He didn't like that." "What happened?" "He refused to release my truck until I paid him for the diagnostic, plus storage fees. Said I was interfering with his business, threatened to file a lien against the vehicle if I didn't settle up. I ended up paying him $2,000 just to get my truck back, and when I took it to Ed Talbot's garage for a real inspection, Ed found nothing wrong with it. The cylinder head was fine. Hanlon had lied." Covington felt his anger rising. This wasn't just opportunistic fraud, it was systematic, predatory. Hanlon was targeting people who were vulnerable, people who couldn't afford to fight back or didn't have the time to challenge him. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "I did," Dinah said bitterly. "Filed a complaint with the county sheriff. They sent a deputy out to talk to Hanlon, and he showed them invoices, diagnostic reports, all perfectly documented. Said I was a disgruntled customer trying to get out of paying for legitimate services. Without hard evidence, it was my word against his. The deputy basically told me to take it up in civil court if I wanted, but that would cost more in legal fees than I'd ever recover. So he's been getting away with it because no one can prove anything," Covington said. "Until now," Dinah replied, tapping his phone again. "This is exactly what we need. Visual evidence that he's tampering with vehicles. If we can show this to the right people, state investigators, maybe the Attorney General's office, they'll have to take it seriously." Covington nodded. "I'm planning to file a complaint with the Oregon DOT, but I want to make sure we've got everything documented. Your experiences, mine, anyone else who's been scammed. The more evidence we have, the stronger the case." Dinah stood up and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of the kitchen. She pulled out a thick folder and dropped it on the table. I've been keeping records of everything. Invoices, receipts, repair estimates from Ed Talbot showing what Hanlon charged versus what the actual problems were. I've also got notes from conversations with other people in town. Ranchers, loggers, even a few truckers who stopped through and got caught in his net. Most of them didn't want to go on record, too scared of retaliation, but they talked to me off the books. Covington opened the folder and flipped through the documents. It was meticulous. Dates, amounts, descriptions of the alleged problems and the actual conditions of the vehicles. Dinah had been building a case for months, maybe longer, just waiting for someone with concrete evidence to come forward. "This is incredible," he said. "With this and my photos, we can make a real case." "There's one more thing," Dinah said. She pulled out a separate folder, this one labeled Insurance Claims. "Hanlon doesn't just overcharge his customers. He's also filing fraudulent insurance claims. I got copies of some of his submissions to insurance companies claiming he did work he never did, inflating costs, billing for parts he never installed. If we can get this in front of an insurance fraud investigator, he's looking at criminal charges, not just civil penalties." Covington stared at the documents, his mind racing. This was bigger than he'd realized. Hanlon wasn't just running a shady tow operation. He was committing insurance fraud on a scale that could land him in prison for years. "How'd you get these?" Dinah smiled faintly. "I've got a friend who works at one of the insurance companies Hanlon deals with. She pulled some records for me off the books. It's probably not admissible in court, but it gives us a roadmap for where to look." Covington leaned back, processing everything. They had evidence, they had documentation, and they had multiple victims willing to testify. What they needed now was someone in authority who would take the case seriously and act on it. "Do you know anyone in law enforcement who isn't tied to Hanlon?" "State police," Dinah said. "There's a trooper stationed in Bend, handles fraud and commercial vehicle violations. Her name's Sergeant Alvaro. I've never met her, but Ed Talbot recommended her. Said she's thorough and doesn't play favorites. If we can get a meeting with her, show her what we've got, she'll investigate." "Then that's our next step," Covington said. He pulled out his phone and started typing notes, organizing the information they'd gathered. "We'll drive to Bend today, meet with Sergeant Alvaro and lay it all out. If she agrees to open an investigation, we'll give her everything. Your folder, my photos, statements from anyone who's willing to go on record." Dinah nodded, but her expression was troubled. "You realize this is going to take time, right? Investigations like this can drag on for months. In the meantime, Hanlon's still operating, still scamming people. And if he finds out we're coming after him, he might destroy evidence or skip town." "Then we move fast," Covington said. "We document everything today, file the complaint, and let the state police handle the rest. Once they start digging, Hanlon won't be able to cover his tracks." They spent the next hour organizing the evidence, making copies of Dinah's records and compiling a timeline of incidents. Covington added his own statement, detailing the breakdown on Santiam Pass, the tow to Hanlon's yard, the fraudulent diagnosis, and his discovery of the disconnected wire. By mid-morning, they had a comprehensive package that would be hard for any investigator to ignore. They loaded everything into Covington's rental car and started the drive to Bend, a 40-minute trip through high desert country that opened up into wide vistas of sagebrush and distant mountains. The Oregon State Police Office in Bend was a low, modern building on the edge of town, with a parking lot full of patrol cars and a reception area that smelled of burnt coffee and floor wax. Covington and Dinah approached the front desk, where a young officer in uniform asked how he could help them. "We need to speak with Sergeant Alvaro," Covington said. "It's regarding a fraud case, commercial vehicle tampering and insurance fraud." The officer picked up a phone, spoke briefly, then nodded. "She'll be out in a minute. Have a seat." They waited in the lobby, the folder of evidence sitting on Dinah's lap like a bomb waiting to detonate. After about 5 minutes, a door opened and a woman in plain clothes emerged. She was in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and sharp, assessing eyes. "I'm Sergeant Alvaro," she said. "You wanted to talk about a fraud case?" Covington stood and extended his hand. "Lyle Covington, this is Dinah Mercier. We've got evidence of systematic vehicle tampering and insurance fraud being committed by a tow operator in Sisters. We'd like to file a formal complaint and request an investigation." Alvaro's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "Come back to my office. Let's see what you've got." They followed her down a hallway lined with filing cabinets and into a small office cluttered with case files and computer printouts. Alvaro gestured for them to sit, then took her own seat behind the desk. "All right, start from the beginning." Covington told the story. His breakdown on the pass, the convenient appearance of Hanlon's tow truck, the fraudulent diagnosis, his nighttime investigation, and the discovery of the disconnected wire. He showed Alvaro the photos, walking her through each image, explaining what she was seeing. Then Dinah took over, describing her own experiences with Hanlon, the repeated scams, the invoices, and the documentation she'd compiled. She handed over the folder, and Alvaro spent the next 20 minutes reviewing every page, occasionally asking questions or making notes on a legal pad. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "This is solid, better than most fraud cases I see. You've got photographic evidence, financial records, multiple victims, and a clear pattern of behavior. I can open an investigation immediately, and based on what you're showing me, I'll recommend criminal charges. Vehicle tampering, fraud, possibly racketeering if we can prove he's been doing this systematically over multiple years." Covington felt a wave of relief. "What happens next?" "I'll contact the county prosecutor's office and brief them on the case," Alvaro said. "We'll need to get search warrants for Hanlon's property, his yard, his office, his financial records. We'll also need to interview other victims, collect additional evidence, and document the full scope of his operation. This is going to take time, probably several weeks at minimum. In the meantime, I need both of you to avoid any contact with Hanlon. Don't confront him. Don't tip him off that we're investigating. If he suspects we're coming, he'll start covering his tracks." "What about my truck?" Covington asked. "It's still in his yard." Alvaro considered this. "We'll include it in the search warrant. Once we execute the warrant, we'll secure all vehicles on the property as evidence. You'll get your truck back, but it might take a few days. Can you live with that?" Covington nodded. He'd already missed his delivery deadline, and his dispatcher had reassigned the load. A few more days wouldn't make much difference at this point. "I can live with it." "Good," Alvaro said. She stood and shook both their hands. "You did the right thing coming forward. A lot of people wouldn't have. They would have just paid up and moved on, but because you didn't, we're going to be able to stop this guy before he hurts anyone else." Covington and Dinah left the state police office and walked back to the rental car, neither speaking for a long moment. Finally, Dinah broke the silence. "Think she'll really follow through?" "Yeah," Covington said. "I think she will. She didn't seem like the type to let something like this slide." "Good," Dinah said. "Because I'm tired of guys like Hanlon getting away with it. Tired of being told there's nothing I can do, that it's just bad luck or my word against his. Maybe this time it'll be different." They drove back to Sisters in silence, the high desert landscape rolling past in shades of brown and white. When they reached the town, Covington dropped Dinah off at her ranch, promising to stay in touch as the investigation progressed. She thanked him, her handshake firm and sincere, and he watched her walk back toward the barn, the border collies trailing at her heels. Then he drove back to his motel, exhausted but satisfied. He'd done what he could. The rest was up to Sergeant Alvaro and the legal system. 3 days later, just before dawn, a convoy of state police vehicles descended on Hanlon's tow yard. Sergeant Alvaro led the operation, armed with search warrants and a team of investigators. They found exactly what Covington and Dinah had suspected: a systematic operation built on fraud. Hanlon's office records revealed dozens of inflated invoices, fake repair orders, and insurance claims for work never performed. His computer contained spreadsheets tracking which vehicles to target, based on their cargo value and the likelihood that the drivers would pay without questioning the charges. In the garage, investigators found tools specifically designed for quickly disconnecting electrical components without leaving obvious signs of tampering: wire pullers, specialized pliers, magnetic clamps. Most damning of all, they found a notebook in Hanlon's desk drawer, filled with handwritten notes documenting his methods. He'd been refining his scam for years, learning from mistakes, adapting his approach based on which lies worked best and which victims were most likely to push back. The notebook read like a manual for fraud: step-by-step instructions on how to disable vehicles, how to write convincing diagnostic reports, how to intimidate customers who ask too many questions. It was arrogance, pure and simple, a belief that he was too smart to get caught. Pruitt Hanlon was arrested at his home that morning, still in his bathrobe, a cup of coffee in his hand when the officers knocked on his door. He didn't resist, didn't protest, just asked for his lawyer and remained silent through the entire booking process. The charges were extensive: 23 counts of fraud, 15 counts of vehicle tampering, 8 counts of insurance fraud, and multiple counts of racketeering and conspiracy. Bail was set at $500,000, which Hanlon couldn't make. He sat in the Deschutes County Jail for the next 6 months while prosecutors built their case. The investigation expanded quickly, revealing that Hanlon had been operating his scam for at least 7 years, possibly longer. Investigators identified 42 victims, including truckers, ranchers, loggers, and tourists passing through the area. The total financial damage exceeded $300,000. Some victims had filed complaints over the years, but without hard evidence, those complaints had gone nowhere. Now, with Covington's photos and Dinah's meticulous documentation, prosecutors had everything they needed to build an airtight case. The trial began in October, held in the Deschutes County Courthouse in Bend. Covington flew back from Oregon to testify, spending 2 days on the stand describing his experience on Santiam Pass and his discovery of the disconnected wire. Dinah testified as well, detailing her repeated encounters with Hanlon and the financial toll his fraud had taken on her ranch. Ed Talbot, the mechanic from Sisters, testified about the discrepancies between Hanlon's diagnoses and the actual condition of the vehicles he'd inspected. One by one, victims took the stand, telling similar stories of convenient breakdowns, inflated repair bills, and a tow operator who preyed on their vulnerability. The defense tried to argue that Hanlon had made honest mistakes, that mechanical failures were unpredictable, and diagnostic errors were part of the business. But the notebook destroyed that argument. There was no way to spin detailed instructions on how to sabotage vehicles as honest mistakes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict: guilty on all counts. Pruitt Hanlon was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 6. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, noted that Hanlon had betrayed the trust of people who were stranded and vulnerable, exploiting their desperation for financial gain. She called it one of the most calculated and callous fraud schemes she'd seen in her 20 years on the bench. Hanlon showed no emotion as the sentence was read, just stared straight ahead, his face blank. Covington attended the sentencing, sitting in the back of the courtroom alongside Dinah. When it was over and Hanlon was led away in handcuffs, Dinah turned to him. "We did it," she said quietly. "We actually did it. "Yeah," Covington said. "We did." They walked out of the courthouse together into the bright October sunshine. The case had taken 8 months from start to finish, 8 months of depositions and interviews and waiting for the wheels of justice to turn. But it had been worth it. Hanlon was behind bars. His tow yard had been shut down and liquidated to pay restitution to his victims, and the scam that had terrorized drivers and locals for years was finally over. 2 years after Pruitt Hanlon's conviction, Lyle Covington found himself driving through Sisters again, this time hauling lumber from a mill in Bend to a construction site in Salem. It was late spring, the snow gone from the lower elevations and the Cascades gleaming white in the distance under a clear blue sky. He hadn't planned to stop in the town. His schedule was tight, and he wanted to make Salem before dark. But as he passed the turnoff for Cloverdale Road, he felt a pull he couldn't quite explain. A need to see how things had changed, to check in on the people who'd helped him bring Hanlon down. He took the exit and drove the familiar route toward Mercier Ranch, watching the landscape roll past in shades of green and gold. The ranch looked different in spring. The fields were lush with new grass, cattle grazing peacefully behind white fences that had been freshly painted. The barn had a new roof, gleaming metal that caught the sunlight, and the house looked well-maintained, its siding recently repaired. There was an air of prosperity about the place that hadn't been there before, a sense that the land was thriving under careful stewardship. Covington pulled up to the gate and climbed out, the familiar border collies bounding over to greet him with enthusiastic barks and wagging tails. He recognized them immediately, older now, their muzzles touched with gray, but still energetic and watchful. One of them nuzzled his hand, remembering him despite the passage of time. Dinah emerged from the barn, shading her eyes against the sun, and when she recognized him, her face broke into a genuine smile. She looked good, healthier than he remembered, the lines of stress that had marked her face during the trial softened by time and success. She was wearing the same kind of work clothes she'd always favored, jeans, boots, a canvas jacket, but they looked newer, less patched and worn. She walked over, wiping her hands on her jeans, and extended one for him to shake. Her grip was firm and warm, the handshake of someone who'd come through a difficult ordeal and emerged stronger. "Lyle Covington," she said warmly. "Didn't expect to see you out this way again. What brings you through?" "Lumber run," Covington said. "Figured I'd stop by, see how you're doing. Place looks good. You've made some improvements." Dinah glanced back at the barn and nodded, pride evident in her expression. "Restitution money from Hanlon's case. I got back most of what he stole from me, plus a little extra from the liquidation of his assets. Used it to fix up the place, upgrade some equipment, put in a new irrigation system last fall, repaired all the fencing, bought 3 new breeding cows. First time in years I've been able to invest in the ranch instead of just patching holes and praying nothing else breaks." She gestured toward the house. "Come in, have some coffee. I want to hear how you've been." They walked toward the house, the border collies trotting alongside them, and Covington took in the details of the property. There was a new equipment shed near the barn, its walls still bright with fresh paint. The driveway had been re-graveled, eliminating the ruts and potholes that had made it treacherous in wet weather. Even the small touches, a repaired gate hinge, replaced fence posts, a newly cleared drainage ditch, spoke to someone who finally had the resources to maintain their property properly, instead of constantly fighting a losing battle against entropy and neglect. They sat at the same kitchen table where they'd first planned their case against Hanlon, and Dinah poured 2 mugs of coffee from a pot that smelled rich and dark. The kitchen itself had been updated. New appliances, fresh paint on the walls, curtains that weren't faded by years of sun exposure. The folder of evidence was gone now, replaced by ranch catalogs and veterinary reports. the normal paperwork of a working operation rather than the weapons of a legal battle. Dinah settled into her chair and studied him with the same sharp eyes he remembered, eyes that had learned to see through deception and recognize truth when it presented itself. "You look tired," she observed, "still running yourself ragged on the road." "It's the life," Covington said with a slight smile. "Can't complain. Company's been good to me since the Hanlon case, gave me a bonus for the testimony, plus hazard pay for the time I was stranded. They also put me on their preferred driver list, which means I get first choice on routes and loads. I've been taking better routes, though. Avoid the pass when I can, especially in winter. Too many bad memories tied up in that stretch of highway." "I don't blame you," Dinah said, her voice carrying a note of understanding that only someone who'd lived through similar trauma could truly convey. "I still think about it sometimes, how close we came to letting him get away with it. If you hadn't decided to investigate, if you'd just paid him and left like so many others did, he'd still be running that scam. How many more people would have been hurt? How many more families would have lost money they couldn't afford to lose?" Covington had thought about that too, more times than he could count. The 42 victims they'd identified during the investigation represented just the ones they could document, the ones who'd kept receipts and records and were willing to come forward. But the prosecutor had estimated that the actual number was probably twice that, maybe more. Drivers passing through who'd paid Hanlon's fraudulent bills and disappeared down the highway, never realizing they'd been scammed. Tourists who'd chalked it up to bad luck and expensive mountain repairs. Local residents who'd been too intimidated or too exhausted to fight back. The ripple effects of Hanlon's fraud extended far beyond the immediate victims, touching families and livelihoods in ways that were impossible to fully measure or quantify. "We got lucky," Covington said, his voice thoughtful. "Right place, right time, and stubborn enough not to let it go. If any one thing had been different, if I'd been less suspicious, if you hadn't kept those records, if Sergeant Alvaro hadn't taken us seriously, Hanlon would still be out there." "You were more than stubborn," Dinah corrected gently. "You were brave. Sneaking into that yard at night, disconnecting his sabotage, gathering evidence knowing that if he caught you, there'd be consequences. That took guts. A lot of people would have been too scared, would have convinced themselves it wasn't worth the risk." Covington shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise as he always was. He'd never seen himself as particularly brave, just practical and unwilling to be taken advantage of. "I was just trying to protect my load. Didn't set out to be anyone's hero." "Maybe not," Dinah said, leaning forward with an intensity that commanded attention. "But that's what you ended up being, whether you meant to or not. And not just for me or the other victims, but for everyone who drives through this area now. People feel safer knowing there's accountability, knowing that if something seems wrong, they can speak up and be heard." She took a sip of her coffee, then set the mug down with a thoughtful expression. The steam rose between them, carrying the rich aroma of Colombian beans. "You know, after the trial, I got calls from other people, ranchers, drivers, even a few mechanics from other towns, thanking me for standing up to Hanlon. Turns out there were a lot more victims than we realized. People who'd been too afraid or too ashamed to come forward during the investigation. They said seeing someone finally hold him accountable gave them hope that the system could work, that justice wasn't just for people with money and lawyers." "That's good to hear," Covington said, meaning it. "Makes the whole ordeal feel worth it. All those hours of testimony, the stress of the trial, the worry that he'd somehow get off on a technicality, knowing it actually made a difference helps." "It was worth it," Dinah said firmly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "But it cost us too. Cost me time, stress, sleep. I had nightmares for months after the trial." Dreams where Hanlon got off on some technicality, or where his lawyer made me look like a liar on the stand, or where I walked into his yard and found myself trapped there, unable to leave. Even now, sometimes I drive past where his yard used to be and I feel this knot in my stomach, like he's still out there waiting, like the whole thing could start up again if I let my guard down. Covington understood that feeling intimately. He'd experienced it himself on the handful of occasions when he'd driven through Sisters since the trial. The physical location of Hanlon's tow yard was gone, demolished, cleared, sanitized of its connection to fraud, but the psychological weight remained. Every time he passed that stretch of highway, he felt his shoulders tense, his grip on the wheel tighten, his eyes scan the roadside for tow trucks that might be lurking. It was an irrational response. Hanlon was locked up, the operation dismantled, but trauma didn't follow logic. It carved grooves in your mind that ran deeper than reason could reach. "You ever hear anything about him?" Covington asked, curious despite himself. "How he's doing in prison?" "Not much," Dinah said, her expression darkening slightly. "Sergeant Alvaro told me he's been a model prisoner, keeps his head down, doesn't cause trouble, participates in the work programs. Probably hoping for early parole, though with his sentence that won't happen for at least another 4 years. Part of me hopes he serves every single day of it. Part of me hopes he has a lot of time to think about what he did, about all the people he hurt, about the damage he caused that can't be undone by restitution checks or apologies." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. "But another part of me, a smaller part, maybe, but it's there. That part wonders if prison's actually teaching him anything, or if he's just biding his time, learning to be smarter about it next time, figuring out what mistakes he made so he doesn't get caught again. Men like Hanlon, they don't change easily. They see the world in terms of marks and opportunities, and unless something fundamental shifts in how they think, they'll just keep doing what they've always done." Covington nodded slowly. He'd thought similar thoughts, especially during the trial when he'd watched Hanlon sit impassively at the defense table, showing no remorse, no recognition of the harm he'd caused. The man had listened to victim after victim describe how his fraud had devastated their lives, and his expression had never changed. No guilt, no shame, just a cold calculation of odds and outcomes. That kind of personality didn't reform easily, didn't suddenly develop empathy after a decade behind bars. It adapted, evolved, found new ways to exploit the same old vulnerabilities. "What about the towing business in general?" Covington asked, steering the conversation in a different direction. "Did anything change after the case? New regulations, oversight, that kind of thing?" "Some," Dinah said, her tone brightening slightly at the shift to more constructive topics. "The state passed new regulations requiring tow operators to carry bonds and submit to regular audits. There's also a complaint hotline now run by the DOT where people can report suspected fraud or abuse. It's not perfect. You still have to navigate bureaucracy, prove your case, deal with operators who know how to game the system, but it's better than what we had before. At least now there's oversight, some accountability beyond just hoping the market will sort out the bad actors." She stood and walked to a drawer, pulling out a folder that she brought back to the table. "I keep tabs on this stuff. Call it a hobby, or maybe an obsession. I track complaints filed with the hotline, read the quarterly reports the DOT publishes, follow up on cases that seem similar to what Hanlon was doing." She opened the folder to reveal printouts of spreadsheets, highlighted passages in regulatory documents, news clippings about other towing scandals in different states. Last year alone, the hotline received over 300 complaints about tow operators across Oregon. Most of them were minor, disputes over fees, disagreements about whether a tow was necessary, but about 40 of them triggered formal investigations. 5 operators lost their licenses, 2 faced criminal charges. Covington leaned forward, impressed by the depth of her research. "You're keeping the pressure on." "Someone has to," Dinah said. "The regulations are only as good as the enforcement, and enforcement only happens when people pay attention. I figured if I was going to go through all that with Hanlon, I might as well make sure it mattered beyond just his case. So I watch, I document, I call out patterns when I see them. Sometimes I'm ignored, sometimes people tell me I'm being paranoid, but sometimes I catch something real, and I can point investigators toward problems before they get as bad as Hanlon's operation was." She closed the folder and pushed it aside. "There's a tow operator up in Klamath Falls right now who's showing some of the same signs Hanlon did. Unusually high rates, vehicles that always seem to need expensive repairs after being towed, customers who complain but can't prove anything. I've been forwarding information to the DOT, encouraging other victims to file complaints. We'll see if it goes anywhere." Covington felt a surge of respect for this woman who'd turned her trauma into action, who'd refused to let her experience with Hanlon be the end of the story. "That's impressive, Dinah. Really impressive." She waved off the compliment, but he could see she appreciated it. "It's just staying vigilant. You do the same thing on the road, don't you? You see something that doesn't feel right, you pay attention, you take precautions. That's all I'm doing, paying attention to patterns, trusting my instincts, refusing to believe that, because we got Hanlon, the problem's solved forever." They talked for another hour, swapping stories about the past 2 years. Covington told her about some of the runs he'd made: a haul to Montana during a spring blizzard, a breakdown in Nevada that turned out to be legitimate and was fixed by an honest mechanic, a close call with a drunk driver in Idaho. Dinah told him about the ranch, the new breeding program she'd started, a difficult calving season, the ongoing battle with predators that saw her cattle as easy meals. The conversation was easy, comfortable, the kind that only happens between people who've been through something significant together and emerged with mutual respect intact. Finally, Covington glanced at his watch and realized how much time had passed. "I should get back on the road. Still got 4 hours to Salem, and I want to make it before dark. They're predicting rain tonight, and I'd rather not be driving through the valley in a downpour." Dinah walked him to the door, the border collies trailing behind, sensing his departure. As Covington stepped outside into the warm spring air, she put a hand on his arm, stopping him. "Listen, I know we didn't know each other long, and we only worked together because circumstances forced us to. But I want you to know you made a difference, not just for me but for a lot of people. Don't forget that. Don't let the years and the miles blur what you did." Covington met her eyes and nodded, genuinely moved by her words. "You too, Dinah. Couldn't have done it without you. Your documentation, your willingness to stand up in court, that was the foundation of everything. I just provided the smoking gun. You provided the entire arsenal." They shook hands one more time, a firm clasp that carried the weight of shared experience and mutual respect. Then Covington climbed into his Freightliner, firing up the engine and easing back onto the highway. As he drove away from the ranch, watching it shrink in his mirrors, he thought about everything that had happened since that February night on Santiam Pass. The breakdown that hadn't been a breakdown. The tow that had been a trap. The investigation that had unraveled years of fraud. The trial that had brought justice. And the aftermath, this moment right now, driving through spring sunshine on a road that felt a little bit safer because people had refused to accept that predators could operate with impunity. The miles rolled past, the Cascades rising on his left, and the high desert opening up on his right. Covington kept his hand steady on the wheel, his eyes on the road ahead, and his mind on the drivers who would come after him. The ones who'd travel these same highways, haul the same loads, face the same risks and challenges. Maybe some of them would encounter another Pruitt Hanlon, another predator waiting in the shadows to exploit their vulnerability. But now, at least, there was a precedent. There was a story they could point to and say, someone fought back once, someone won, and if it happened before, it could happen again. 4 hours later, as the sun was beginning its descent toward the Coast Range, Covington pulled into the construction site in Salem and delivered his lumber load. The foreman signed off on the paperwork, complimenting him on the condition of the cargo. No damage, properly secured, delivered exactly on schedule. It was routine praise, the kind every driver hoped to receive, but it felt good nonetheless. A reminder that most of the time, the job was just the job. Pick up a load, drive carefully, deliver safely, move on to the next one. The dramatic incidents, the fights against fraud and corruption, those were the exceptions rather than the rule. Most days were just miles and deadlines and the satisfaction of work done competently. As he secured his empty trailer for the return trip, his phone buzzed with a message from his dispatcher. Another load waiting in Portland, heading east to Boise, departure tomorrow morning at 6. Covington confirmed the assignment and started the drive toward Portland, the evening light fading to dusk as he merged onto I-5. The highway was busy with commuter traffic, cars and trucks jockeying for position, everyone trying to get home or get to their next destination. He kept his speed steady, maintained proper following distance, and let the familiar rhythm of the road settle over him like a comfortable old coat. Covington thought about home, his small apartment in Eugene, modest but comfortable, filled with books and photographs from 3 decades on the road. Framed pictures on the walls showed him standing beside various trucks he'd driven over the years, each one representing a different chapter of his life. There was one photo in particular he treasured, himself and Dinah on the courthouse steps after Hanlon's conviction, both looking exhausted but vindicated, flanked by Sergeant Alvaro and a handful of other victims who'd testified. He'd framed it and hung it in a place of honor, a reminder of what could be accomplished when people refused to be victims. He'd be at his apartment by midnight if traffic cooperated, could sleep in his own bed for once instead of a truck stop bunk or a cheap motel. The prospect was appealing, but it also felt temporary, like a brief pause between journeys rather than a true destination. The road was where he belonged, where he'd always belonged, and he knew he'd be back on it tomorrow, chasing the next load, the next deadline, the next mile. That was the life he'd chosen, and despite everything, the dangers, the stress, the encounters with people like Hanlon, he wouldn't trade it for anything. But the road had changed, or maybe he had changed, or maybe both. He no longer saw it as just a ribbon of asphalt connecting cities and towns, a blank canvas where nothing mattered except arrival and departure. He saw it now as something more complex and nuanced, a network of lives and livelihoods, a place where people were vulnerable but also resilient, where bad things happened but good people fought back. Hanlon had tried to turn the road into his personal hunting ground, a place where he could prey on the stranded and desperate without consequences. But he'd failed, brought down by a trucker who refused to be a victim and a rancher who refused to stay silent. That was the real lesson of Santiam Pass, the truth that Covington carried with him on every subsequent journey. Not that the road was dangerous, he'd always known that, but that people were stronger than the dangers they faced, stronger and more resourceful, capable of fighting back when they had to, capable of building systems and networks that protected the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. The regulations that came after Hanlon's conviction, the hotline that gave victims a voice, the increased scrutiny on tow operators, all of those things existed because people had refused to accept fraud as just the cost of doing business in remote areas. Covington reached Portland just after 10 o'clock, and navigated through the city streets to his apartment complex in the St. John's neighborhood. He parked the Freightliner in the lot reserved for commercial vehicles, locked the cab with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed the routine thousands of times, and walked to his unit on the second floor. Inside, everything was as he'd left it. Clean, quiet, familiar. The small space that held his life when he wasn't on the road. He dropped his bag by the door, kicked off his boots, and collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion finally catching up with him. But before he let himself drift off to sleep, he pulled out his phone and sent a text message to Dinah. Made it to Salem. Delivered clean. Thanks for the coffee and the conversation. Stay safe out there. Her response came a few minutes later. You too, Lyle. Drive careful. And thanks for stopping by. Means more than you know. Covington set the phone aside and closed his eyes, the sounds of the city filtering through the window. Distant traffic on Lombard Street. A dog barking somewhere in the neighborhood. Voices from a neighboring apartment where a family was having dinner. Normal sounds. The soundtrack of normal life. Tomorrow, he'd be back on the road, heading east through the Cascades again, probably taking Highway 20 past Sisters and Bend, maybe even past the spot where Hanlon's yard used to be. He'd drive past it, and he'd remember everything that had happened there. But he wouldn't be afraid, wouldn't let the memory poison the road for him, because the road belonged to people like him and Dinah. People who worked hard, played by the rules, and refused to let predators dictate the terms of their existence. It belonged to the honest mechanics like Ed Talbot, who called out fraud when they saw it, to the waitresses like Betty, who warned vulnerable travelers, to the investigators like Sergeant Alvaro, who took complaints seriously even when it would have been easier to dismiss them. The road was a community, held together by shared rules and mutual trust, and that community had proven it could police itself when it needed to. Years later, when Covington finally retired from trucking at the age of 65, he would look back on the Santiam Pass incident as the defining moment of his career. Not because it was the most dramatic. He'd had closer calls with weather, mechanical failures that could have been catastrophic if they'd happened at different moments, but because it had shown him what he was capable of when he refused to accept injustice. He'd spent 3 decades hauling freight across the West, facing every kind of challenge the road could throw at him. Storms, breakdowns, accidents, difficult clients, impossible deadlines. But nothing had tested his character quite like Pruitt Hanlon, and nothing had given him the same sense of lasting satisfaction as seeing justice served. The retirement party his company threw for him was held at a truck stop in Eugene, in the same diner where he'd eaten breakfast before countless runs. His dispatcher was there, along with a handful of fellow drivers who'd worked the same routes over the years. But the guest he was most surprised to see was Dinah Mercier, who'd driven 3 hours from Sisters to attend. She'd brought a gift, a framed photograph of Santiam Pass in winter. The mountains majestic and beautiful, with an inscription on the back, where you proved that one person can make a difference. Thank you for your courage. They talked for a long time that evening, catching up on the years since they'd last seen each other. Dinah's ranch had continued to thrive, and she'd become something of an advocate for rural businesses, speaking at agricultural conferences about fraud prevention and the importance of documentation. She served on a state advisory board that reviewed towing regulations, using her experience with Hanlon to push for stronger protections and better enforcement. Her testimony had helped shape new policies that made it harder for predatory operators to exploit vulnerable communities. Covington told her about his final years on the road, the changing industry, the new technologies that made trucks safer but also more complex, the younger drivers who were entering the profession without the same kind of hands-on mechanical knowledge that his generation had possessed. He worried sometimes about what would happen when drivers couldn't recognize the signs of tampering, when they relied entirely on diagnostic computers that could themselves be manipulated. But then he reminded himself that each generation found its own way, developed its own skills and instincts. The specifics changed, but the core remained. Pay attention. Trust your gut. Don't accept easy explanations when something feels wrong. "What are you going to do with all your free time?" Dinah asked him late in the evening, after most of the other guests had left. They were sitting at a corner booth, nursing coffee that had gone lukewarm, neither in a hurry to end the conversation. "Not sure yet," Covington admitted. "Thought about maybe doing some consulting work, helping trucking companies develop better safety protocols, training new drivers on how to spot fraud and tampering. Or maybe I'll just take some time, travel for pleasure instead of work, see parts of the country I've always driven past but never stopped to explore." "You should write a book," Dinah suggested, "about Hanlon, about the case, about what it taught you. There are people who need to hear that story, not just truckers, but anyone who's ever felt powerless against someone with more resources or influence." Covington considered that. "I'm not much of a writer. Never was good with words on paper." "You don't have to be fancy," Dinah said. "Just honest. Tell it the way you lived it, straightforward, no embellishment. That's what would make it powerful." He promised to think about it, though he wasn't sure he'd follow through. Writing felt too introspective, too focused on himself when the story had really been about all of them. Dinah, Sergeant Alvaro, the other victims, even Ed Talbot and Betty the waitress. Everyone who'd played a part in bringing Hanlon down. But maybe that was exactly why the story deserved to be told, because it demonstrated what was possible when ordinary people decided to act. Months after his retirement, Covington did start writing, though not a book. He wrote letters instead, to young drivers his former company hired, sharing lessons from his decades on the road. He wrote about recognizing mechanical problems before they became dangerous, about reading weather patterns, about managing fatigue. And he wrote about Santiam Pass, about trusting your instincts when something felt wrong, about the importance of documentation and persistence when fighting fraud. The letters were popular enough that his old dispatcher started sharing them with new hires, and eventually they were compiled into a training manual that the company distributed widely. Dinah Mercier continued to run her ranch, building it into one of the most successful cattle operations in Central Oregon. But she also became a voice for rural businesses dealing with predatory practices, testifying before the state legislature multiple times on proposed regulations affecting towing, vehicle repair, and consumer protection. Her story, and Covington's, became case studies used in law enforcement training programs across the country, examples of how ordinary people could take down sophisticated fraud operations through persistence, courage, and meticulous documentation. She never forgot the trucker who'd stopped at her gate that spring morning 2 years after the trial, photos in hand and evidence gathered, ready to fight when most people would have just paid and moved on. And Covington never forgot the rancher who'd spent years documenting abuse, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that justice sometimes moved slowly, but could be made to move if you pushed hard enough and refused to give up. Their paths didn't cross often after that retirement party. Both were busy with their own lives, separated by geography and the demands of daily existence. But they stayed in touch through occasional phone calls and emails, checking in on each other, sharing updates about developments in the ongoing fight against predatory towing practices. When Dinah learned of another suspicious towing operation, she'd call Covington for advice on how to approach it. When Covington heard from a young driver who'd been scammed, he'd put them in touch with Dinah, who'd walk them through the documentation process. The network they'd inadvertently created, victims helping victims, Experienced advocates guiding newcomers through the system became a model for other regions dealing with similar problems. Consumer protection advocates in Washington and Idaho reached out, asking for advice on building similar support networks. Law enforcement agencies incorporated their methods into training programs. The ripple effects of that February night on Santiam Pass continued spreading, touching lives and changing systems in ways neither of them could have fully anticipated. Sergeant Alvaro, who'd taken their complaint seriously when others might have dismissed it, went on to head the Oregon State Police's Commercial Crimes Unit. She used the Hanlon case as a template for investigating similar scams, training other investigators on the warning signs of vehicle tampering fraud, the importance of listening to victims even when their claims seemed implausible, and the value of building comprehensive cases that left no room for defendants to slip through procedural cracks. Her work led to the identification and prosecution of 3 other tow operators running similar schemes in different parts of the state, dismantling what investigators came to call the Breakdown Network, a loose confederation of unethical operators who preyed on travelers in remote areas. The highway through Santiam Pass continued to challenge drivers every winter, its steep grades and sharp curves demanding respect and skill. Avalanche warnings were posted regularly, chain requirements enforced strictly, and the Oregon Department of Transportation maintained increased vigilance over the area after the Hanlon case highlighted how vulnerable stranded motorists could be. But the way stations and tow companies that served the pass operated under stricter scrutiny now. Their activities monitored and audited in ways that made fraud harder to commit and easier to detect. Drivers passing through Sisters still broke down occasionally. It was inevitable, given the harsh conditions and the mechanical realities of pushing heavy vehicles through mountain terrain. But they had resources now, hotlines to call if they suspected fraud, regulations that protected them from predatory practices, a community of fellow drivers who shared information about which operators were trustworthy and which ones to avoid. The road was safer, not because the dangers had disappeared. Mountains would always be mountains. Storms would always be storms, but because people had learned to recognize and resist the human dangers that had once operated in the shadows. On cold February nights, when snow fell heavy on the pass and visibility dropped to near zero, truckers sometimes told stories about the driver who'd been stranded in a blizzard and discovered a scam that had been running for years. The details varied depending on who was telling the story. Sometimes the trucker was younger or older, sometimes the scam was even more elaborate. Sometimes the villain got away or faced worse punishment. But the core remained constant. It was a story about refusing to be a victim, about fighting back when the odds seemed impossible, about the difference one person could make when they decided that enough was enough. Lyle Covington never sought recognition for what he'd done. He didn't give interviews to trucking magazines or appear at industry safety conferences to talk about his experience with Hanlon. He simply went back to work after the trial, hauling freight across the West, doing his job with the same quiet competence he'd brought to it for 3 decades. Even in retirement, he avoided the spotlight, preferring to help quietly from the sidelines rather than positioning himself as any kind of hero or expert. But among drivers who knew the story, and there were many, because stories like that spread through the trucking community like wildfire, he was respected in a way that transcended his years of service or his safety record. He was the trucker who'd stood up when it mattered, who'd refused to let himself be scammed, who'd brought down a predator that had terrorized the mountain roads for too long. His name became shorthand for doing the right thing even when it was difficult, for trusting your instincts even when others dismissed your concerns, for persisting until justice was served. The last time Covington drove through Sisters before his retirement, he stopped at the High Desert Cafe for breakfast one final time. Betty, the waitress who'd first warned him about Hanlon all those years ago, was still working the morning shift, older now, but still sharp-eyed and quick with the coffee pot. Her hair had gone completely gray, and she moved with the slight stiffness of someone whose joints protested years of standing on hard floors. But her smile was as warm as ever. She recognized him immediately and poured his coffee without asking, then leaned against the counter with the easy familiarity of an old friend. "Heard you're retiring," she said. "End of an era. Time to let the younger drivers take over," Covington said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "I've done my part." "More than your part," Betty said, her voice carrying genuine respect. "What you did for this town, for all the people Hanlon hurt, that won't be forgotten. You gave us our dignity back, showed us that we didn't have to just accept being taken advantage of. That matters more than you probably realize." Covington shrugged, uncomfortable as always with praise, but he accepted it with more grace than he once would have. Age and experience had taught him to recognize when people needed to express gratitude, when accepting their thanks was actually a gift you gave them rather than something that diminished you. Just did what needed doing. Anyone else would have done the same. "That's where you're wrong," Betty said firmly. "Most people wouldn't have. Most people would have paid up, grumbled about it, and moved on. That's why what you did was special. Not because it was complicated or required superhuman abilities, but because you chose to act when action was difficult and risky. That's what makes it matter." She refilled his coffee and moved on to other customers, leaving Covington alone with his thoughts and his breakfast. As he ate, eggs over easy, hash browns, wheat toast, the same meal he'd ordered countless times over the years, he watched the morning light spread across the mountains visible through the cafe's front windows. The Cascades were timeless, had been there long before he was born and would be there long after he was gone. They didn't care about human dramas, about fraud cases and trials and justice served. They simply existed, beautiful and indifferent, a reminder that some things endured regardless of what happened in the valley below. But the people who lived in that valley, who worked the ranches and drove the highways and served the coffee, they cared. They remembered. And because they remembered, the next person who tried what Hanlon had done would face resistance, would encounter a community that knew the warning signs and refused to be exploited. That was the true victory, Covington realized. Not just stopping one predator, but creating a culture where predators couldn't operate freely, where people looked out for each other and shared information and refused to accept fraud as simply the price of doing business in remote areas. As he finished his breakfast and paid his bill, leaving a generous tip for Betty, Covington thought about all the roads he'd traveled, all the loads he'd hauled, all the miles that had passed beneath his tires. The highway had given him a life, a career, a sense of purpose. It had also given him challenges, dangers, moments of fear and doubt. But through it all, it had taught him the most important lesson: that the road belonged to everyone, and everyone had a responsibility to protect it. Not just from physical dangers like ice and sharp curves, but from the human dangers, the predators, the scammers, the people who saw vulnerability as opportunity rather than a reason for compassion. Pruitt Hanlon had tried to own a piece of that road, to make it his personal territory where he could exploit the stranded and desperate without consequence. But he'd failed, because he'd underestimated the people he was preying on. He'd thought they were weak, isolated, easy targets who would pay up and disappear without causing trouble. He hadn't counted on someone like Lyle Covington, a man who'd spent his entire adult life on the road, who knew its rhythms and dangers, who'd learned when to trust and when to question, who'd developed instincts honed by decades of experience. And he definitely hadn't counted on Dinah Mercier, a woman who'd documented every injustice with methodical precision, who'd kept meticulous records even when no one was listening, who'd waited patiently for the right moment and the right ally to turn suspicion into action. Together, they'd proven that the road wasn't a lawless place where might made right, and the powerful could do as they pleased. It was a community, held together by shared rules and mutual respect, where justice was possible if people were willing to fight for it. That was the legacy of Santiam Pass, the lesson that would outlive all of them, that vulnerability didn't mean weakness, that isolation didn't mean helplessness, and that one person's decision to stand up could change everything. As Covington walked out of the cafe into the bright spring morning, he looked back one more time at the mountains rising to the west. Somewhere up there, on a curve he could probably still navigate from memory, was the spot where his truck had failed and Hanlon's trap had been sprung. It looked peaceful now, beautiful even, the peaks gleaming with snow under a cloudless sky, a postcard image that gave no hint of the darkness that had once lurked in the valley below. But that darkness was gone now, driven out by light. The light of scrutiny, of accountability, of people who refused to accept that predators could operate with impunity. The road was safer because of it. Not perfectly safe, it never would be, but safer. And that was enough. Covington climbed into his Freightliner one last time before retirement, fired up the engine, and pulled onto the highway heading west. The road stretched before him, familiar and welcoming, carrying him toward whatever came next. Behind him, sisters receded in the mirrors, and with it the memories of that long-ago February when everything had changed. But the lessons remained, carved into him as permanently as the grooves worn into the asphalt by millions of passing tires. Pay attention. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Don't accept easy answers when something feels wrong. And most importantly, you're never as powerless as someone wants you to believe you are. Those lessons had served him well on the road, and they'd serve him well in whatever came after. The highway had been his teacher, his home, his proving ground. And in that moment on Santiam Pass, when he'd chosen to investigate rather than accept, to fight rather than submit, it had shown him exactly what he was capable of. That knowledge, that certainty that he'd stood up when it mattered, was worth more than any load he'd ever delivered, more valuable than any paycheck he'd ever earned. It was the knowledge that when faced with injustice, he hadn't looked away, and that made all the difference.